The first sign that something was off happened during my morning routine, though at first it seemed so trivial I almost brushed it off. I was in the kitchen making coffee just like every other morning. I reached for the mug, brought it to the machine, and pressed the button. The whir of the machine, the steady drip of coffee, the smell, everything was in its usual place. But then, as I brought the mug to my mouth, I noticed it was empty. Strange. I clearly remembered watching it fill up. I frowned, placed the mug down, and hit the button again. This time it filled up, or so I thought, until I went to take a sip and once again found it empty. I laughed it off, thinking maybe I was sleepier than I realized. I tried a third time, and finally I had coffee in the mug. But even after my first sip, something felt off, a tingling in the back of my head that wouldn't go away. I was convinced I was still groggy, caught in some kind of half-dream. On the way to work, it happened again. I was driving down the same quiet stretch of road I took every morning, windows down, radio on, that lazy morning sun just peeking over the trees. There was a man standing at the crosswalk, waiting for the light. I remember him clearly because he was wearing a fluorescent yellow jacket, and I remember thinking it looked almost cartoonishly bright against the gray sidewalk. But as I passed, I felt this sudden jolt, like a ripple in my vision. I glanced back in my rearview mirror, and for a split second, he wasn't there. Just gone. Then, as I blinked, he was back, standing there as if nothing had happened. I shook it off as a trick of the eye. It was early. Maybe the light had hit the mirror at a weird angle. But the feeling lingered, nagging at me. At work, things only got stranger. My coworker, Jason, was already in the break room when I walked in. We exchanged nods, the same polite, morning mutterings we always did. I went over to the coffee machine, filled my cup, and heard him say something about surviving another Monday. I laughed, made some comment about caffeine being my only lifeline, and went to sit down at my desk. Then, not even 10 minutes later, I walked past the break room again on my way to the copier, and there was Jason, standing at the coffee machine as if he'd never left. Surviving another Monday, he said, holding up his mug with the exact same casual nod. I froze, staring at him, trying to process what I'd just heard. It was word for word, exactly what he'd said earlier. I glanced around the room, looking for some sign that he was messing with me, but he just blinked, completely unaware, sipping his coffee like everything was normal. Maybe I was imagining things, I told myself, but then it kept happening. An hour later, I heard the same line from Jason again. Same smile, same mug lift, same surviving another Monday, huh? By the third time, I was starting to feel like I was in some twisted prank. My colleagues went about their day, seemingly oblivious, and whenever I tried to explain it, they'd laugh it off, say I needed more sleep. I wasn't sure if I should laugh along or scream. I couldn't focus after that. The office felt strange, distant, like I was observing it from behind glass. Time itself felt slippery, moments overlapping. I kept catching glimpses of people out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement, then nothing there when I turned. I tried to talk myself out of it, tell myself it was just stress, but that gnawing sensation at the back of my mind kept building. Then, right around noon, I decided to get some fresh air and walk down to the little sandwich shop across the street. The guy behind the counter, Sam, has known my order for years. Ham and cheese with extra pickles, right? He said, smiling as he always did. I nodded, letting myself relax a little, happy to be somewhere familiar. But when he handed me the sandwich, I felt that weird deja vu again. I looked down at the receipt, only to find a timestamp showing a time that was 2 hours ago. Confused, I checked my watch, then my phone. Both of them said noon. I handed Sam the receipt, laughing awkwardly, but he just stared at it like it was totally normal. It's been a busy day, he said, shrugging, and turned to help the next customer. I left feeling unsettled, glancing back as if I expected the whole place to dissolve. My hands were shaking by the time I got back to the office. Every little thing felt amplified. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the soft clicking of keyboards, the murmur of voices, all blending into this cacophony that was too loud, too vivid, like I was trapped inside an echo. Then, at the end of the day, as I was gathering my things, Jason walked over, patting my shoulder. Hey, remember, we're surviving another Monday, right? I stared at him, not even trying to hide my frustration. You've said that exact line to me 3 times today, Jason. I blurted out, half laughing, half desperate. He looked genuinely confused. What? This is the first time I've seen you all day. He frowned, tilting his head. You all right, man? That night, the unease didn't go away. I replayed the day in my head, trying to make sense of it. The repetition, the missing time, the strange feeling that everything was just slightly out of sync. I went to bed, hoping sleep would clear my mind, that I'd wake up and find everything back to normal. But the next morning, it was worse. I woke up to my alarm, went to the kitchen, started making coffee. Same steps as yesterday. I watched the mug fill, felt the warmth in my hands. But when I brought it to my mouth, it was empty. I froze, staring at the cup. Slowly, I placed it back on the counter, feeling my heart race as I pressed the button again. The machine whirred, coffee filled the mug, but when I picked it up, empty. Panicking, I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I looked around, expecting something, anything, to explain what was happening. My phone buzzed with a notification. It was Jason, texting, "Surviving another Monday, huh?" It was Tuesday. My brother Greg was the last person anyone expected to see on the rooftop that cold December night. He was the steady one in our family, the kind of guy who held the railing on escalators and never pushed the gas pedal past the speed limit. Yet there he was, perched on the edge of the rooftop like a daredevil, and it felt wrong. I watched him from a distance, my breath clouding in the air, heart thudding in my chest. The day had gone on as usual, or as usual as things could be since he'd lost his job. He'd shrugged it off, called it a minor speed bump, but I knew better. Greg was good at pretending things didn't bother him, and I was better at pretending to believe him. It was late by the time I got there, the city lights stretching out below like the scattered pieces of some impossible puzzle. I hesitated, then took a step closer, the crunch of snow underfoot breaking the silence. He didn't look back, just stayed there, shoulders hunched against the cold, staring out into the vast nothingness of the night. I didn't know what to say, or if saying anything would matter. Greg wasn't the type to spill his guts. He kept his struggles to himself since we were kids, when he'd get teased for being scrawny or for bringing lunches that smelled like the leftover fish dinners our mom insisted were good for us. He'd wave it off, make a joke, move on. But here we were, Greg and me, on a rooftop in the freezing dark. I thought of calling his name, then decided against it. It didn't seem like he was looking for company. Instead, I took a step back, trying to respect the silence, let him have his space. I leaned against the wall, watching him and listening to the city's hum, the low murmur of traffic below punctuated by the occasional honk or shout. The sound was oddly comforting, grounding me in reality. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Time felt suspended, like the air, like everything. Finally, Greg moved, shifted slightly as though realizing I was there, and turned to face me. His eyes, usually bright and a little mischievous, were dull. He looked tired, so very tired. I opened my mouth, ready to say something, but he beat me to it. "Did you know," he started, his voice barely audible over the city noise, "that squirrels bury so many acorns that they can't remember where most of them are? Like they lose over half of them." He let out a short laugh, a sound as brittle as the winter air. "Some of them even grow into trees. The acorns, I mean, because the squirrels just forget." I wasn't sure where he was going with this, but I nodded, playing along. "Nature's little gardeners, I guess." "Right," he murmured, his gaze shifting back to the lights. "That's what we are, isn't it? Just running around, trying to bury things, forgetting them, hoping they grow into something better." I wanted to say something comforting, something that would reassure him, but I couldn't find the words. Greg had always been the one who seemed like he had everything figured out, and here he was, hinting at a vulnerability I'd never known he had. He'd always been the older brother who teased me, protected me, and guided me when I needed it, but he was never open about his own fears. And now, standing on the edge of that rooftop, I realized how little I actually knew him. "Are you all right, Greg?" The question felt clumsy, inadequate, but I didn't know what else to say. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "I don't know. Some days it just feels like there's a giant hole in me. And I keep trying to fill it with work, with responsibilities, with all these little things. But it's never enough. I'm just burying acorns, hoping something grows." He let out a breath, a cloud of steam that drifted up into the night. And lately it feels like maybe it won't. Like maybe all I'll ever have are these holes. It hit me then, the weight of what he was saying. This was more than a rough patch or the frustration of losing a job. Greg was grappling with something deeper, something that had been building for years. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't looking for advice or solutions. He just needed someone to listen. I said after a pause, I think everyone has holes like that. And maybe it's okay if they don't all get filled. Maybe some things just stay empty. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might argue, say something dismissive or sarcastic like he usually did. But he didn't. He just stood there, taking in my words, and slowly nodded. We stayed like that for a while, two figures silhouetted against the city lights, sharing the silence, each of us holding our own unspoken fears. In that quiet, something shifted between us. The distance that had always existed, the one I'd never known how to bridge, seemed to shrink. Finally, Greg turned to me and gave a small, tired smile. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't explain further, and I didn't ask. I was on a work assignment in a small coastal town, far from where I'd normally spend my days, tucked away in my city apartment. It was one of those sleepy places that only ever got busy in the summer, and by the time I arrived in early fall, the streets were practically empty. The quiet was a welcome change, I thought. I'd be here for just a few weeks, gathering some client interviews for a project, and figured I'd blend right in. No one paid much attention to strangers in places like this. My first day there, I went to the only cafe within walking distance of my rented cottage. The place was nearly deserted, but the coffee smelled strong, and the morning light streamed through the windows in warm slants. The barista was a tall, middle-aged man who introduced himself as Gary. He seemed friendly enough, quick with a smile, and we chatted briefly as he prepared my coffee. As I was about to pay, he waved his hand, saying, "Consider this one on the house. Welcome to the neighborhood." It was a small kindness, and I left feeling slightly buoyed by the warm welcome. The next morning, I went in again, hoping for a repeat of the previous day's friendly vibe. But this time, Gary greeted me with a warm familiarity that struck me as odd. "Hey, Sarah," he said with a friendly smile as I approached the counter. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't told him my name. I'd only been in town for a day, and I didn't recall even using my credit card to pay. How did you know my name?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Gary laughed, waving a dismissive hand. "It's a small town. Word travels fast. You're the new girl working on a project, right?" I nodded slowly, shrugging it off as a quirk of small-town life. But I couldn't shake a feeling of unease as I sipped my coffee. Later that day, I ran a few errands around town. At the post office, the woman behind the counter mentioned how nice it was for a city girl like me to spend time in their town. When I asked how she knew I was from the city, she just smiled. "Just a lucky guess," she said. Still, I felt an odd chill. I brushed it off as small-town nosiness, but something about the way people seemed to know me already was unsettling. On the third morning, Gary greeted me at the cafe again. This time, he didn't just know my name. He knew I'd been at the beach the evening before. "Hope you enjoyed our sunset," he said with a wink. I hadn't seen anyone else there, let alone mentioned it to anyone. When I asked how he knew, he gave a vague answer about keeping an eye out for new friends. I laughed it off awkwardly, but I left the cafe quickly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. A few days passed with more strange encounters. Every time I left my cottage, it seemed I ran into someone who'd reference something I'd done recently. "Saw you got groceries yesterday," the man at the general store said, commenting on the specific snacks I'd bought. "Hope you're settling in." Another day, a neighbor stopped me while I was walking back from the post office and said, "How's the project going? You found any good quotes yet?" I was stunned. I hadn't spoken to anyone about my project, and I wondered if someone had been asking around on my behalf. But why would anyone care? One evening, after a particularly long day of work, I decided to treat myself to a drink at the only bar in town. I was halfway through my drink when Gary appeared. He sat down at the bar, too close, his presence unexpectedly heavy. He ordered a drink and then turned to me with a wide grin. "Surprised to see you out tonight," he said. "Figured you'd be too tired after that long day of interviews." I hadn't told anyone my schedule, but he rattled off exactly who I'd spoken to, and what time I'd wrapped up. I felt my stomach twist. I decided I'd had enough. I excused myself quickly, saying I had an early morning. He grabbed my arm just as I was turning away, his smile fading. "You really should stay. People are counting on you to fit in here, you know?" His grip wasn't hard, but his eyes were cold. I managed to pull my arm away, muttering something about needing sleep. The walk back to my cottage felt like it took hours. Every sound in the dark, every rustle in the trees, made me jump. I felt watched. No, I knew I was being watched. The next day, I went out as early as possible, hoping to avoid running into anyone. I walked to the beach, needing some quiet to clear my mind. It was still, the morning mist hanging low over the waves. I stood there, just listening to the ocean, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, half expecting Gary, but no one was there. As I looked around, I noticed something odd in the sand, a pair of footprints, exactly where I had stood the night before. Right next to them were another set, fresh and deep, stopping just a few feet behind mine. Back at the cottage that evening, I tried to work but found myself glancing over my shoulder, feeling jumpy. I even started locking the bathroom door whenever I showered, which seemed silly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might just walk in. As I was drying off, I heard my phone buzz with a text. I glanced down, heart stopping cold. Leaving the water on like that could flood the place. It was from an unknown number. I hadn't told anyone I'd left the bathroom sink running for a few minutes while I undressed. I started shaking, the phone slipping from my hand. In a panic, I packed my things and decided to check into a hotel a few towns over, just for a night to clear my head. As I drove out of town, I felt a sense of relief, like I was finally putting distance between myself and whatever strange energy was lurking back there. But just as I was getting on the main road, my headlights caught something by the side of the road, a figure. It was Gary standing by the road, watching my car. His face was calm, but his eyes, there was something dark, something knowing. He raised a hand in a small wave as I sped past. I finally arrived at the hotel and tried to relax, but the unease wouldn't leave. I lay awake in bed, every small sound amplified in the dark room. Around midnight, there was a soft knock at the door. I froze, heart pounding. The knock came again, more insistent. I crept to the peephole, terrified of what I might see. But when I looked out, no one was there. The next morning, I returned to the cottage, determined to finish my work and leave as soon as possible. But when I arrived, I found an envelope tucked under the door. Inside was a single piece of paper with neat handwriting. "People notice when you try to leave." I packed my bags that afternoon and didn't stop driving until I was hours away from that town. For weeks after, I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard someone outside my window or footsteps just outside my door. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somehow, was still keeping tabs on me. I tried to rationalize it, convincing myself it was all in my head. But sometimes, late at night, my phone buzzes with notifications, unknown numbers sending me photos of places I've recently visited. And I can't help but feel that I didn't really escape anything at all. It happened on a late summer evening in August, when the air still clung to the heat of the day, but the skies were dark enough that you felt the first hints of autumn in the breeze. I was driving back to my small hometown after visiting friends in the city, a trip I'd done countless times before. Usually, I wouldn't take this route at night, as it cut through a remote area of woods and farmland, miles from any gas stations or rest stops. But I was tired and didn't want to add extra time by sticking to the main highway. I figured the Tulane road would be faster, even if it was darker and lonelier. About 20 minutes in, my low fuel light flickered on. I cursed under my breath, calculating the miles left. There was a gas station ahead, an old one I rarely used, but I'd seen it open late sometimes. I hoped they were still running tonight. Sure enough, as I pulled up, the place looked abandoned, but for one fluorescent light buzzing above the pump island. The windows were dark, and the only car in the lot was an ancient, beat-up truck parked off to the side. I felt a prickle of unease, but the need for gas outweighed my discomfort. I'd be quick. I got out, swiped my card, and started filling up. As I waited, I looked around and noticed something strange. That truck parked in the shadows wasn't empty. A man was in the driver's seat, watching me. He had on a baseball cap pulled low, so I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes following my every move. There was an intensity in his gaze, something unsettling and predatory. I tried to act normal, ignoring him as best I could, but my heart was beating a little faster. I remember thinking, he's just some guy. Don't make it weird. You're almost done here. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full, and I exhaled in relief. As I reached for the nozzle, the man suddenly opened his door and started getting out of his truck. I froze. He was tall, with a wiry build and a haggard look about him, like someone who hadn't slept in days. His clothes were rumpled, and I noticed his hands were smeared with something dark. Dirt? Grease? Blood? It was hard to tell in the flickering light. He was walking toward me now, and his expression was unreadable, a little too blank. There was no smile, no attempt to greet me, just a steady, direct approach. Every instinct screamed at me to get in the car and lock the doors, but I didn't want to look like I was scared or running away. I forced a smile and tried to sound casual. "Hey there, everything all right?" I said, my voice shaky. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he looked me up and down like he was sizing me up. "You're driving alone, huh?" His voice was low, gravelly, and he tilted his head in a way that felt almost curious, like he was studying a bug under glass. "Yeah, just passing through," I replied, trying to sound breezy. "Gotta get back home before it gets too late." He didn't respond, just kept looking at me with that same blank expression. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and I felt my skin crawl. Something about him was off. Not just creepy, but dangerous. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew I needed to get away from him fast. "All right, well, good night," I said, moving toward my car door. I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, he lunged forward, grabbing my wrist in an iron grip. My heart slammed in my chest as I felt his fingers tighten, cold and rough against my skin. "Why you in such a hurry?" he said, his voice softer now, almost whispering. His face was inches from mine, and I could smell his breath, stale, with a hint of something metallic. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. I could scream, but there was no one around for miles. In my car, I couldn't remember if I'd locked the other doors. If he got in, I'd be trapped. I tried to yank my hand free, but his grip was unyielding. "Let go of me," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. He didn't move, just stared at me with those cold, dark eyes. For a second, I thought he was going to drag me into his truck. I imagined headlines, stories of girls who disappeared on lonely roads, the ones people never found. Then, suddenly, headlights appeared, flooding the lot with light. A car was pulling in from the road, its high beams illuminating us both. The man's grip loosened just enough for me to break free, and I stumbled back, pulling my hand against my chest. He shot a glance at the approaching car, his expression darkening. I could see the anger flashing across his face, but he quickly masked it, shoving his hands into his pockets. The car pulled up to the pump next to mine, and a middle-aged woman got out, glancing at us curiously. I managed to give her a weak smile, but I was shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. The man backed up, giving me one last look, a look that promised this wasn't over. "You take care now," he said, his tone mocking. Then he turned and walked back to his truck, moving casually as if nothing had happened. He climbed into the driver's seat, and within seconds, his taillights disappeared down the road, swallowed by the darkness. The woman who'd pulled in must have seen something in my face, because she immediately asked if I was okay. I nodded, though I could feel tears welling up. I couldn't shake the feeling that if she hadn't arrived, I might not have made it out of that gas station. I thanked her and hurried back to my car, locking the doors the second I was inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. His eyes, his grip, the way he looked at me like I was prey. It was as if he knew something, some dark secret he'd only reveal at the very last second. For weeks after, I kept seeing his face in crowds, convinced he was lurking somewhere nearby. I avoided gas stations at night, took different routes home, even switched up my routine. But that feeling of being watched, of being hunted, it never fully went away. I'd be out in public, minding my business, and suddenly feel a chill, like his eyes were on me again. I'd turn, expecting to see him, but he'd never be there. Just shadows and strangers. To this day, I don't know what he intended, but I can guess. I've read enough stories to know how encounters like that can end. And every so often, I'll check local news, looking for reports of anyone who went missing in that area. It's silly, I know, but part of me wonders if he found someone else that night. If, for some unfortunate soul, a car didn't pull in just in time. And maybe, somewhere out there, he's still waiting. It all started on a Thursday. I was at my favorite cafe, nestled in the corner with my laptop, typing away and trying to catch up on work. That's when I noticed him for the first time. He was sitting 2 tables away, sipping a coffee and flipping through a magazine. He seemed average enough, brown hair, a worn-out jacket, probably in his late 30s. I wouldn't have given him a second thought if he hadn't looked up just as I glanced over. Our eyes met, and he gave me a polite nod before returning to his magazine. I chalked it up to one of those awkward stranger moments and went back to my work. Later that evening, I stopped by the grocery store on my way home. I was reaching for a box of pasta when I saw him again, just a few aisles away. It felt like déjà vu, but stronger, a weird, unsettling familiarity. He was just standing there, looking at a display of canned soup, but something about his presence felt off. I brushed it aside as another coincidence, though, and carried on. The next morning, as I walked to the bus stop, he was there again, leaning against the bus shelter. This time he looked right at me and gave a small smile, as if we were old friends. I quickly looked away, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me as I waited for the bus to pull up. I boarded quickly, hoping he wouldn't follow, but he stayed behind. Even so, I couldn't shake the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. That night, my phone buzzed with a notification from my social media app. A new follower. I didn't think much of it until I clicked on the profile. The username was just a jumble of letters, and there were no posts, no followers, no profile picture. But something in me knew it was him. I tried to reason with myself. He couldn't have found me online so quickly. I had my privacy settings on. Besides, it could just be a bot or some random person. I blocked the account and decided not to think about it. The following week, I went out with a friend to a new restaurant on the other side of town. We were deep in conversation when I felt someone staring. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was again, sitting alone at a table across the room. He wasn't eating. He wasn't even pretending to be on his phone. He was just looking. I felt my stomach drop, the food suddenly tasting bitter. My friend noticed my discomfort and asked if everything was okay. I mumbled something about an upset stomach, not wanting to sound paranoid, but I could barely focus on the rest of the evening. I kept glancing over, and each time, he was still there, eyes fixed on me with that unnerving intensity. After that night, I started seeing him more frequently, too frequently to dismiss it as a coincidence. Once, I spotted him in the parking lot outside my gym, just sitting in his car, staring. Another time, he was behind me in line at a bookstore, but when I turned to confront him, he just smiled politely and asked if I knew where he could find a specific book. His voice was calm, almost friendly, and his gaze was steady, but there was a hollowness in his eyes that made my skin crawl. I told him I didn't know and quickly paid for my books, practically running out of the store. I began altering my routines, taking different routes to work, changing my grocery store, avoiding my favorite cafe. I even stopped posting on social media, fearing he was somehow tracking me through my updates. But it didn't help. He kept appearing, always in the background, always watching, but never doing anything overtly threatening. There were no confrontations, no angry messages, no attempts to touch or harm me. Just that constant, silent presence, like a shadow I couldn't shake. It was maddening, the way he kept himself just on the edge of my awareness, close enough to unsettle me, but far enough to seem almost harmless. The breaking point came one night when I was home alone. I was trying to relax, watching TV and ignoring the lingering unease that had become a part of my daily life. I heard a faint knock on my door. I froze. My heart started pounding so loudly I could hear it echoing in my ears. I waited, hoping it was just my imagination, but then I heard it again, soft but insistent. I crept over to the peephole, my breath hitching when I saw him standing on the other side, hands shoved in his pockets, head tilted as if he were listening for any sign of movement inside. My first instinct was to call the police, But what would I even say? That a stranger I'd seen a few times was standing outside my door? That he hadn't done anything illegal, but somehow felt wrong? I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe, praying he would go away. After what felt like an eternity, he finally left, but I stayed up the whole night, too afraid to sleep, jumping at every creak and groan the apartment made. In the following days, his presence seemed to intensify. Every time I left the house, he was somewhere nearby. A reflection in a shop window, a figure in my peripheral vision, a familiar jacket disappearing around a corner. My friends started noticing my paranoia, and I tried to explain, but it sounded so ridiculous when I said it out loud. He hadn't done anything to me, hadn't even spoken to me since that day at the bookstore. It was like he was playing some kind of twisted game, leaving me just enough room to doubt myself. Was this all in my head? Could I just be seeing things, reading too much into harmless encounters? But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't a coincidence. There was an intent behind his presence, something cold and calculating that I couldn't quite grasp. I felt trapped, my every movement anticipated, every attempt to shake him thwarted. I started seeing his face in my nightmares, always watching, that empty gaze drilling into me, stripping away any sense of safety I once had. My apartment felt smaller, the walls pressing in on me as if to remind me there was no escape. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, a specter haunting my every step, feeding on my growing fear. Then, last week, I received a letter in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photo of me, taken from a distance as I walked down the street. On the back, in neat, precise handwriting, were the words, "See you soon." My stomach twisted, while rising in my throat. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I couldn't describe. That photo shattered any illusion that I might just be imagining things. This was real. He was watching, following, and now he wanted me to know that he was in control. I went to the police the next day, but they listened with a look of restrained impatience, jotting down notes with a skeptical nod here and there. No crime had been committed, they said. There was nothing they could do. Maybe it was just someone with an unusual sense of humor, they suggested, as if that was supposed to reassure me. I left feeling more helpless than ever, my only hope now that he would get bored and move on. But every day since then, I feel him nearby. I catch glimpses of him in crowds, reflections in mirrors, shadows that linger just a little too long. My life has become a game of survival. Each day a struggle to maintain some semblance of normalcy while knowing that he's out there, watching, waiting. I can't shake the feeling that this is exactly what he wants. That every moment of fear, every sleepless night, every paranoid glance over my shoulder is feeding something twisted inside him. Now, as I sit here, writing this, I can't help but wonder, is this all just a terrible coincidence, a string of bad luck that will eventually pass? Or have I somehow become a character in someone else's obsessive plan, with no way? When I moved into apartment 4B, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It was small, sure, but for the price, practically a steal. It had character too. An old brick building, high ceilings, hardwood floors that creaked like they had a story to tell. Felt like a fresh start. I was starting a new job in a new city, and 4B felt like the perfect little hideaway. First couple of nights, everything was fine. I'd unpacked, arranged my furniture, and tried to settle in. There were only a few small quirks, like the flickering light in the kitchen and an old, musty smell that clung to the bathroom, but nothing I couldn't handle. On the third night, though, I noticed something that felt off. I'd gone to bed with my phone plugged in on the left side of my bed, as usual. But in the morning, it was on the right, lying neatly on my nightstand as if I'd placed it there myself. I brushed it off, assuming I'd moved it in my sleep. That day, after work, I came home to find a coat I'd tossed on the arm of the couch, neatly draped over the back instead. Strange, but maybe I was being overly paranoid. I've always been a bit absent-minded, so it was easier to convince myself I'd just forgotten. But then it started happening with other things. Little things. The throw pillow on my bed shifted from one side to the other. My toothbrush moved from the right side of the sink to the left. I began finding dishes stacked in odd ways in my cupboards, ways I knew I hadn't left them. One evening, I came home to find my closet door wide open, though I distinctly remembered shutting it that morning. I tried to brush it off, rationalize it as my nerves adjusting to a new place. But each day, the changes became harder to ignore. One night, I decided to test it. I placed my phone in the center of my bedside table, balanced precariously so any movement would be obvious. I positioned my slippers precisely at the edge of my bed. I went to sleep with a weird sort of excitement, half hoping and half dreading that I'd find something out of place. And sure enough, when I woke up, my phone was back on the right side, and my slippers were neatly aligned against the far wall. I felt a chill slide down my spine. Someone had to be messing with me. I called the building manager, Mr. Herrera, but he looked at me like I was crazy. "You're the only one with a key," he said, jingling a massive ring of keys in his hand. "And the lock's never been tampered with." He promised to change the locks just in case, but I could tell he thought I was wasting his time. I almost believed him until that night. When I walked in, something was different again. There was an old rocking chair in the corner of my living room, something straight out of a horror movie. It was painted white, chipped in places, but I'd never seen it before in my life. I called Mr. Herrera again, furious, but he insisted I'd signed off on the furniture inventory, including the chair. "No way," I protested, but there it was on the sheet. I tried sleeping in the living room that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I could swear I heard a soft creak from the chair. The next morning, I rushed out the door, eager to be anywhere but there. I spent the whole day at work in a haze, struggling to focus. I didn't want to go home, but eventually I had to. When I unlocked the door, my stomach sank. The chair was gone. In its place was a small table with an old-fashioned rotary phone. I stared at it, feeling something deep in my gut twist with unease. It looked like it belonged, but I knew it wasn't there yesterday. I tried calling Mr. Herrera again, but he didn't pick up. I had a heavy feeling that asking him again would be pointless anyway. I started cataloging the changes. Every day it was something new. The walls, which had been painted a dull beige, began showing patches of peeling wallpaper in places. Faded blue and yellow florals crept out from beneath the paint. By the end of the week, nearly every wall was covered in that ugly wallpaper that hadn't been there when I moved in. There was no pattern to it. One morning, I woke up to find an ornate mirror hanging above my dresser, so tall it almost reached the ceiling. The mirror wasn't just reflective. It was like looking into a different version of my room, one where everything looked older, as if it had been sitting there for decades. And every time I passed by, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that vanished as soon as I turned to look. One night, when I was brushing my teeth, I glanced at the mirror and noticed something written faintly in what looked like condensation, though the bathroom was bone dry. "Who are you?" The words stayed there for only a second before they faded, leaving the glass spotless. I laughed nervously, tried to shake it off as stress, but I felt watched, followed by a silent observer that I couldn't see. I tried staying at a friend's place, but each time I returned, it was like the apartment pulled me back in. On the last night I spent there, I sat up in bed, eyes wide open, and watched. It was dead silent until around 3 in the morning, when I heard the faint sound of a door creaking. But there was no one there, no door moving, no sound except for that infernal creak echoing down the hallway. And then I felt it, a presence sitting at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt the pressure, the weight of someone. I didn't sleep a wink. By morning, I'd resolved to leave. I couldn't take another night there. I packed a few things and ran out without looking back. Mr. Herrera wasn't surprised. He only shook his head with a knowing look. "You're not the first," he said, his voice almost a whisper. 4BS always been strange. People come and go. No one stays. I moved out that afternoon and got a place on the other side of the city. I didn't even care about getting my deposit back. But the strangest thing was when I looked up the building's records, I found that apartment 4B had been empty for decades. The building's layout didn't even match the room I'd been living in. There was no 4B listed on the tenant records, only an old maintenance closet between units 4A and 4C. It had been converted into some kind of makeshift apartment back in the 1950s, but condemned shortly afterward. I don't know who or what I was sharing that apartment with, but I know I'll never forget the feeling that I was somewhere I was never meant to be. And every so often, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still feel that same presence hovering at the foot of my bed, like it followed me, and that somehow I'm still there in 4B, waiting for whatever lies in that place to decide it's time for me to leave for good. It started with the smell. I had just moved into a new apartment, a small place in a nondescript building on the quieter side of town. Rent was cheap, the landlord was friendly, and my neighbors seemed all right. But there was this faint, sour smell that lingered in the hallway. At first, I chalked it up to the age of the building, but as days went on, the smell grew stronger, even seeping under my door some nights. It was strange, pungent, like rotting citrus, and no one else in the building seemed to notice. I'd see them coming and going as usual, all nodding and smiling as they passed me, while I wrinkled my nose at the stench that no one else reacted to. After about a week, I brought it up with Mr. Gleason, the landlord, a quiet man with a deep smoker's voice. I caught him outside, puffing on a cigarette as he swept the walkway. "Hey, do you know what that smell is in the hallway? It's kind of off-putting." I laughed, trying to sound casual. Mr. Gleason didn't laugh back. Instead, his expression went blank, as if he hadn't even heard me. He took a drag of his cigarette and let it out in a slow, lazy puff before saying, "Some things get worse before they get better," then went right back to sweeping. I stood there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Worse before they get better? What was that supposed to mean? That night, I heard noises through the walls, muffled voices I couldn't quite make out. I assumed they were coming from my next-door neighbor, a woman named Carla who lived alone. She seemed nice enough, friendly even, when we'd exchanged hellos in the elevator. But tonight, her voice was different. It sounded like she was talking to someone, her tone hushed, almost urgent. I leaned closer to the wall, straining to make out her words. But all I could hear were odd, rhythmic taps, like someone drumming their fingers on a table. I pressed my ear closer, and the tapping stopped. I stayed there, frozen, until I heard the faintest whisper on the other side of the wall. It almost sounded like my name. The next morning, Carla greeted me as if nothing had happened. She smiled bright and cheerful, asking about my new job and offering me homemade cookies she'd baked. I wanted to ask her about the noise from last night, but something about the way she looked at me, head tilted just a bit too far to the side, made me hold back. Her smile was a little too wide, her gaze a little too fixed. She kept watching me, waiting for me to take a cookie, so I did, biting into it even though my stomach was already knotted. The taste was off, too sweet with a metallic aftertaste that I couldn't quite place. She seemed pleased, nodding slowly as I chewed, so I forced a smile, thanked her, and practically ran back to my apartment. Days went by, and the noises continued, always late at night, always just as I was drifting off. Muffled voices, taps, the occasional scuffle of feet, and once a cry. I was sure of it, a high-pitched, muffled cry that made my heart race. I rushed to my door, opening it just a crack to peek into the hallway. It was empty, eerily quiet, and the smell was back stronger than ever. I stood there, staring at the darkened hallway, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just the building settling or some plumbing issue. But deep down, I knew something was off. One evening, as I was coming back from work, I noticed a new neighbor moving into the apartment across the hall. He was tall, with an oddly stiff posture, and he didn't look at me as he carried his boxes inside. I watched him for a moment, hoping for an introduction, but he ignored me entirely, even when I cleared my throat loudly. A few days later, I saw him again in the elevator, staring straight ahead, his eyes wide and unblinking. His skin looked almost waxy, his face expressionless, as if he were carved from stone. I forced myself to say hello, but he didn't respond, didn't even blink. He just kept staring straight ahead, unmoving until the doors opened, and he stepped out without a word. After that, things only got stranger. Carla, who'd once been so friendly, now avoided me entirely. I'd catch her looking at me in the hallway, her eyes darting away the moment I turned toward her. And then there was Mr. Gleason. I rarely saw him anymore, but one night, I heard a shuffling sound outside my door and opened it just in time to see him standing there, his head tilted down, staring at the floor. When he realized I was watching, he looked up, his face blank, and said in that same raspy voice, "Things get worse before they get better." Then he turned and walked away without another word. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the tapping again, louder this time. It was coming from all around me, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It felt like the whole building was alive, pulsing, breathing. I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but the sounds only grew louder, drowning out my own heartbeat. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I lay there in the silence, my breath shallow, my skin cold with sweat. And then, from somewhere outside my door, I heard the faintest whisper. It was my name, clear as day, soft and insistent. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to confront Mr. Gleason, demand an explanation. But when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I tried again, louder, until one of the other neighbors, a woman I'd seen in passing, appeared behind me. She looked at me with wide, fearful eyes, shaking her head slowly. "Mr. Gleason doesn't live here anymore," she whispered. "He moved out years ago." I stared at her, confusion and dread creeping up my spine. "But I just talked to him last week," I stammered. She just shook her head, her face pale. "Mr. Gleason passed away last year. He was the last one to go." The woman backed away, her eyes darting down the hallway, as if afraid someone might see us talking. Without another word, she hurried off, leaving me standing there, alone and bewildered. I returned to my apartment, locking the door behind me, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it was all some elaborate prank or misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew there was something much darker at play. That night, the noises started again, louder than ever. The walls felt like they were closing in, the tapping more frenzied, almost desperate. I pressed myself against the door, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short gasps. And then, in the silence between the taps, I heard it. My name, whispered over and over, from every direction, as if the building itself were calling me. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of the door creaking open and a single, cold hand resting on my shoulder, pulling me back into the darkness. I'd been with Dave for 6 years, through college and our first jobs, and we had just signed the lease on a cute little apartment together. Our friends and family thought we were rock solid. "When's the wedding?" was practically a greeting from everyone in our lives. I always laughed it off, saying we were focused on our careers first, but a part of me knew I wanted it, rings, vows, all of it. Then came the late-night work meetings that I laughed off for a while. Dave had always been responsible, but I started noticing he was constantly on his phone, which he'd always left lying around before. Now he'd take it with him to the bathroom, to bed, even to the kitchen just to pour a glass of water. He'd laugh off my jokes about him being so glued to it, but then he added a password. I hadn't even noticed until one night I saw him swipe it out of the corner of my eye. The first sign was his withdrawal, like someone slowly dimming the lights in a room until you're left in darkness. We used to be each other's sounding boards. He'd tell me about his day, and I'd tell him about mine, even the boring parts. Now he'd brush me off with vague answers like, just the usual or nothing much. It seemed strange, but I brushed it off as him being tired. We all have phases, right? But things kept escalating. He started coming home later than usual, always with a ready excuse. We had a client dinner, or the meeting ran long. Once, he came home at 2 a.m., barely able to look me in the eyes. I wanted to believe him, but my gut was twisting in ways I hadn't felt before. It wasn't long before I noticed the smell. Not perfume exactly, but this faint trace of something floral. I caught it on his shirt when he hugged me, and it clung to him like a ghost. "Maybe someone at work is wearing something strong," he'd said with a nonchalant shrug. My stomach sank. I remember lying awake that night, replaying every interaction, every tiny change in his behavior, searching for clues like a detective in my own life. The real breaking point came one Friday night. He had a work thing again, and I decided to meet up with some friends for drinks to take my mind off things. Around midnight, I got a text from my best friend. "Hey, isn't that Dave?" She attached a blurry picture of 2 people cozied up in a booth at the far end of the bar, his hand on her thigh, her head resting on his shoulder. I felt this rush of heat, anger, disbelief, shame, all blending into one horrible, sinking feeling. Without thinking, I hailed a cab to the bar, convinced I needed to see it for myself. By the time I got there, he was gone. When he came home, he smelled like a combination of alcohol and her perfume. I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Did you have a good time with your work friends?" I spat out, barely able to look at him. He froze, eyes widening, but quickly regained his composure, spinning some ridiculous story about needing to meet with clients who insisted on a late-night karaoke session. I remember staring at him, feeling so disgusted, yet desperate for him to tell me something, anything that would erase that image from my mind. A few weeks passed, each day worse than the last, each night colder than the one before. I could feel him slipping away like sand through my fingers, and nothing I did or said seemed to matter. He stopped kissing me goodbye in the mornings, barely looked me in the eyes when he came home. I was losing him piece by piece, and he was barely even there to notice. I think the worst part was when I began to doubt myself. Was I being paranoid? Was this all in my head? I'd catch glimpses of his phone screen, watch him typing furiously, and the way he would angle it away from me became my silent confirmation. The day I found out was a Tuesday. I'd taken a sick day, unable to concentrate at work because every time I closed my eyes, I saw him with her. I was lying on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, trying to drown out my thoughts with reruns when his phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a message preview. "Can't wait to see you again." My heart stopped. I picked up his phone and saw that he'd forgotten to lock it. My hands shook as I scrolled through their messages, piecing together the affair like shards of glass. That evening, I confronted him, my voice a mix of anger and sadness. He looked shocked, but his face quickly contorted into frustration, even anger. "Why were you looking at my phone?" he demanded, as if I'd committed the real betrayal. I didn't have words. I'd loved this man, built a life with him, and he was accusing me. It was surreal. He tried to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but I had nothing left to give him. He packed his things, telling me he'd be back for the rest, and I just watched numb. He left, and with him went every plan we'd made, every dream I'd held on to, crumbling around me. I'd lost him long before I knew it. This was just the confirmation. Weeks passed. I kept replaying everything in my head, overanalyzing every moment, every interaction, wondering what I could have done differently. But as the days went by, I realized something. It wasn't my fault. I hadn't failed him. He'd failed us. I finally allowed myself to let go, piece by painful piece, until the version of us I'd been holding on to faded into a bittersweet memory. I got home from work, dragging my feet and tossing my keys onto the table by the door, where I usually leave them. Exhausted, I barely noticed my favorite pen sitting next to the keys. Just like always, old, a little scratched up, a reliable friend through countless meetings and endless paperwork. I threw myself onto the couch, flicked on the TV, and tried to let the day slip away. But when I got up to get a drink later, I saw the pen again. The exact same position, same angle, as if I'd never touched anything on that table. I brushed it off. Maybe I just missed it before. But the thing was, I could have sworn I'd moved it slightly when I tossed my keys down. It seemed silly to dwell on, so I tried to forget it. Over the next couple of days, other little things started cropping up. I'd glance out my apartment window while having my morning coffee and noticed the same white van parked across the street. At first, I assumed it belonged to a neighbor or maybe a contractor, but every time I looked, it was there, in the exact same spot. One morning, I even marked the tires with a faint smudge of chalk as a casual experiment, just to see if it moved. But the van stayed perfectly in place, unmarked, as if my chalk had disappeared. Things were subtle enough that I could have written them off as the result of a tired mind. But the glitches kept piling up. One evening, on my walk home, I saw a dog tied outside the corner store, a scrappy little brown mutt with a red collar. No big deal. But as I passed the same spot a few blocks later, I saw the exact same dog tied up at a different store, same collar, same scuffed leash, same way it was looking off into the distance. I stopped, blinking in confusion, and just stared at it, wondering if maybe I'd gotten turned around. But no, this was a different street, a different store, and the dog was in the exact same position. I tried rationalizing it, telling myself that small, eerie repetitions happened all the time, and most people just didn't pay attention. Yet, the feeling that something was off clung to me like a shadow. The world around me was starting to feel like a movie set, where the same props were recycled from scene to scene, placed with precision in the same way every single time. I started to feel like I was an actor in a play where everyone else knew the script, and I didn't. One night, as I left work late, I was about halfway home when I caught sight of a blue sedan parked near the bus stop. I'd seen this car around plenty, but when I passed by it again in front of a pharmacy a few blocks away, I felt a wave of unease. I walked faster, and when I glanced back, it was there again, right behind me, parked perfectly on the side of the street. The hairs on my arms stood up. This couldn't be random. I reached my building and slammed the door behind me, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt too still, too quiet. I got up to check the door locks 3 or 4 times, and every time I turned, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. By morning, my nerves were frayed. The next few days, I kept noticing the same car, the same people. A woman in a yellow coat who always seemed to be walking just ahead of me, her head turned slightly away. A man in a green cap who was always carrying a brown paper bag, no matter the time of day. They weren't there every single second, but just often enough that they felt more like set pieces than people. Sometimes I'd stop walking and let them pass, or cross the street to avoid them, but they'd appear again, maybe blocks later, without explanation, and then the cycle would repeat. The tipping point came one evening when I sat down to eat dinner. I'd cooked some pasta, settled into my chair, and was halfway through when my phone buzzed. I glanced down and saw a message from a friend, inviting me to grab drinks. I set my fork down and thought about it, but ultimately decided to finish my meal and relax at home. When I looked back down, my plate was full again, completely untouched, as if I'd never started eating. I stared at it, feeling a cold twist in my stomach. Had I just spaced out? Was I so exhausted that I'd imagined eating half my dinner? I pushed the plate away, suddenly queasy, and got up to pace around the apartment. As I walked past the table by the door, I noticed my favorite pen again, lying in the exact same spot. This time, I was certain I hadn't left it like that. I'd been carrying it around all day at work. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in my hand, and set it down somewhere else on purpose, just to see what would happen. The next morning, I found it back by the door, perfectly positioned next to my keys as if it had never moved. I felt a growing sense of panic, a creeping realization that maybe I wasn't the one moving things after all. Maybe something else was setting everything back, resetting my life in tiny, careful increments. Was someone watching me? Or worse, was someone controlling this? At work, I couldn't concentrate. Everything around me felt staged, like my cubicle was part of a set. The people I passed in the hall seemed too predictable, their conversations blending into an eerie hum of scripted dialogue. When I stepped outside, I saw the blue sedan parked across the street, the same one I'd seen every day this week in the same exact spot. The same woman in the yellow coat walked by with that same determined stride, eyes fixed straight ahead. A part of me wanted to shout, to grab her, and demand to know if she saw it too, if she felt the constant churn of deja vu. But I didn't. Instead, I just started walking. I kept my head down, trying not to notice the familiar sights, hoping that maybe I could ignore the feeling long enough for it to disappear. But it didn't. Every detail felt like it was mocking me, daring me to figure it out. When I finally reached my apartment that night, I stopped in the entryway, feeling like a puppet that had finally had its strings cut. I sat on my couch, staring at the pen on the table by the door, its position taunting me. I began to wonder if there was a larger pattern, if the world was on some kind of endless loop that I was just a tiny part of. And then a thought crept in, one that chilled me to the bone. What if none of it was real? What if my entire life, every memory, every choice was just part of some simulation, a carefully designed set of routines that someone somewhere had programmed? I laughed, a hollow sound in the stillness of the room. Because even if it was true, even if my whole existence was nothing more than a loop, what could I do about it? And did it even matter? In the silence, the answer settled around me like a weight. It didn't matter. Or maybe it mattered so much that acknowledging it would break me. So I did the only thing I could. I picked up my pen, placed it back on the table, exactly where I'd found it, and waited for the world to reset again. I've never been one for ghost stories. Even as a kid, I rolled my eyes whenever my friends would try to scare each other with tales of haunted houses or cursed objects. But last year, I moved into an old apartment in a small town, and what happened there has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about what's real and what isn't. The building was ancient. Creaky floors, drafty windows, the kind of place where you'd expect a permanent musty smell. But the rent was cheap, and it was close to my new job, so I figured I could tolerate it. From the first night, though, something felt off. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a faint sense of being watched. I chalked it up to new place jitters and went on with my routine. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke up for the first time. I'm not a light sleeper, but something had yanked me out of my dreams. My bedroom was completely dark, and as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something strange. The door to my closet, which I always left closed, was open just a crack. It's not like I was sure that I had closed it, but I always closed it. I pulled the covers up a little tighter, forced myself to ignore the creeping sense of unease, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself, or maybe the door had a loose latch. But that night, I woke up again, this time to a distinct creaking sound coming from the corner of the room. My heart pounded as I tried to stay completely still, listening. It was that same feeling again, like something was watching me. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force myself to ignore it, but there was no way I was going back to sleep. After what felt like hours, I finally worked up the courage to turn on my bedside lamp, hoping the light would reveal nothing unusual. The room was empty, but this time, the closet door was wide open. After that, I started paying more attention to the little details around the apartment. During the day, it felt normal, almost inviting, but as soon as the sun went down, something changed. The air grew heavy, almost stifling, and the shadows seemed thicker, lingering in the corners as if they were waiting for something. I convinced myself it was just nerves and overactive imagination, maybe even stress from work. But when the incident started happening during the day, I knew it wasn't just me. One Saturday afternoon, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth when I caught something in the mirror. A quick blur, like a shadow passing by the doorway. I turned around instantly, but the hallway was empty. My pulse quickened, and for the first time, I felt real fear. I'd heard of people seeing things out of the corner of their eye, but this was different. It felt deliberate, like whatever was wanted me to see it. And worse, it wanted me to know I was alone with it. After that, the noises started. First, it was just subtle creaks or the occasional rattle from the kitchen, as if something had shifted. But soon it escalated. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard a scraping sound from the hallway, like nails dragging along the floor. I froze, straining to listen. The sound continued, slow and steady, moving closer to my bedroom. My body was paralyzed with fear as I heard it stop right outside my door. I couldn't bring myself to look. I squeezed my eyes shut, listening to the silence, waiting. But nothing happened. Eventually, I must have drifted off from sheer exhaustion. But when I woke up, my bedroom door was ajar. I hadn't left it open. The final straw came about a month later. By this point, I was exhausted, barely sleeping, and constantly on edge. I tried everything, locking my doors, sleeping with lights on, even leaving the TV on at night to create some kind of background noise. But none of it stopped the feeling of being watched or the strange sounds in the apartment. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I'd pack a bag, stay with a friend, anything to get out of there for a night of decent sleep. I was in the kitchen, stuffing random items into my bag, when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of breath on the back of my neck. I froze, too terrified to turn around. My mind was racing, screaming at me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. Then a voice, barely a whisper, so close it felt like it was inside my ear. It only said one word, "Stay." I bolted. I didn't even look back to grab the rest of my things. I ran down the stairs and out of the building, not stopping until I was at my friend's place across town. I barely slept that night, and the next day, I called my landlord to give notice. I didn't care about the lease or the deposit. I was done. A few days later, I returned with a friend to grab my stuff. As we were packing, my friend paused, holding something up. "Hey, did you know this was in here?" she asked, pulling a small, dusty book from the top shelf of my closet. I'd never seen it before, but it looked old, the cover worn and faded. Curious, I flipped it open. The pages were filled with strange symbols, scribbled notes, things that looked almost like instructions or rituals. The last page, though, was what got me. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words: "If you hear it, you can't leave. If you feel it, it's already here." I don't know who lived there before me or what they were doing with that book. I don't even know if they're still alive. But as soon as I left, I could finally breathe again. The constant feeling of being watched, the heavy presence, it all lifted, as if I'd broken free from whatever was in that apartment. But here's the thing. A few days after I moved out, I got a text from an unknown number. All it said was, "Why did you leave?" I tried blocking the number, deleting the message, but it didn't stop. Every few days, I'd get another message, always asking me why I'd left, begging me to come back. I moved again, changed my number, deleted my social media, trying to disappear from anyone who might be trying to find me. But every now and then, I'll get an email, always from a new address, always with the same message. I don't know if it's a person messing with me, or if it's something else, something I let out of that apartment. All I know is every time I open my inbox, my stomach drops, half expecting to see those words again, asking me to come back. And every time I see them, I wonder what would happen if I did. Once, when I was young and unprepared, I found myself standing on the edge of disaster, looking into the gaping maw of pure, unfiltered terror. It was supposed to be a simple trip back to visit family in the mountains, an easy weekend away from the stress of city life. I thought nothing of it when I packed light, just a bag and some snacks for the road. But as I hit the winding, narrow roads leading up the mountain, the weather had other plans. Out of nowhere, a thick fog descended, covering the road like a shroud. So dense, I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. I kept driving slowly, barely creeping forward, hoping that any moment the fog would lift, but it only got thicker. To make things worse, rain began to pour, and the road turned into a slippery, twisting nightmare. There was no shoulder, only a steep drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. Every turn was a blind one, and I realized with mounting dread that I was entirely alone, isolated in the dark, wet grip of the mountains. I was about halfway up when my car suddenly sputtered and died, the engine giving out with a sad little whine. My heart dropped. I tried the ignition again and again, but nothing. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, on a treacherous road with no cell signal, no light, and no help. For a moment, I sat there in the deafening silence, the rain hammering against the windshield, feeling the cold seep into my bones. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold, a long, high-pitched scream echoing through the mountains. I remember gripping the steering wheel, telling myself it was just the wind. I was certain of it. Even as the scream came again, closer this time, reverberating off the rocks. I sat frozen, listening, as the rain slowed, giving way to an eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, moving in the fog, watching me. Minutes dragged on like hours, and just when I thought I couldn't take the silence anymore, I heard footsteps crunching softly over the wet gravel just outside my car. My heart pounded as I strained to look through the foggy glass, but all I saw were faint shadows shifting in the darkness. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't think, until something scraped against the side of the car. The noise was slow and deliberate, like nails dragged across a chalkboard, sending shivers down my spine. I fumbled for my phone, even though I knew there was no service, hoping for a miracle. As I did, the scraping stopped. Dead silence again. I sat in the dark, my hand hovering over the door handle, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. Then, without warning, the fog parted just enough for me to catch a glimpse of a figure standing barely a few feet from my car. Pale, gaunt, and motionless, they were looking right at me with hollow, dark eyes. I couldn't see their face clearly, but it felt like they could see right through me. I swallowed, trying not to scream, as they took a single step closer, then another, their hand reaching out toward my window. In that instant, I don't know what came over me, but I turned the ignition one more time, and by some miracle, the engine roared to life. I slammed the gas, skidding forward, the tires slipping on the wet road. I didn't look back, didn't think, just drove as fast as I dared, ignoring every curve and every warning sign, heart racing, mind blank with fear. I didn't stop until I was miles down the mountain, where I finally pulled over, shaking, and looked back at the dark, foggy road. There was no one behind me, no sound, nothing. But I swear, sometimes when I drive alone at night, I still hear that scream echoing in the distance, haunting my memory, reminding me of the day I came face to face with something I can never explain. It started with a photograph. I found it buried in a drawer one evening, cleaning out my desk for the first time in years. It was an old Polaroid, curled at the edges and faded. In it, a group of people was gathered around a bonfire, faces half lit, the scene spilling with laughter. There was something hauntingly familiar about the photo, even though I didn't recognize anyone in it. They were strangers to me, but the more I looked, the more I felt a strange pull, like I was on the edge of remembering a joke just told seconds ago, but the punchline was forever slipping out of reach. I tossed it aside, blaming fatigue for the odd sense of familiarity, and moved on. 2 nights later, I heard a voice in my apartment, low and muffled, like it was coming from the other side of a wall. I paused, the hairs on my arms standing up as I strained to listen, but all I could make out was a murmur. When I checked the hallway, though, it was empty and my neighbor's door was closed. The building had thin walls, so I chalked it up to him talking on the phone, though I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was off, like it was trying too hard to sound casual, normal. Things went on like that for a while, little moments of strangeness that I forced myself to ignore. I'd turn off the light in my bedroom, only to come back and find it on again. Books that I was sure I'd left on the shelf would end up on the floor. It was easy enough to explain it all away. Maybe I was more tired than I realized, or maybe I'd forgotten about things I'd done myself. Then came the encounters with people I could have sworn I'd never met before, but who seemed to know me. It started with a man in the grocery store who smiled at me like an old friend and said, "Hey, long time no see." When I hesitated, he frowned and asked, "Don't you remember me? I'm Mike from last summer." He trailed off, a shadow crossing his face, but when I insisted I didn't know him, his expression turned apologetic. "Sorry," he said quickly. "I must have mixed you up with someone else." But that wasn't the only incident. There were others. A woman on the subway who sat beside me and nudged my shoulder, saying, "You never called me back." When I told her I had no idea who she was, she laughed, though her eyes held something unsettling, like she was doubting me more than herself. A few days later, I walked into my office and found a mug on my desk with the words, "Happy Birthday, Ben," scribbled in bright letters. My name's not Ben. The strangest thing, though, was the sound. I began hearing it at odd hours, a faint rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was just a leaky pipe, but it was too deliberate, almost like someone was tapping in code. Late one night, I sat up in bed, listening, and realized it was coming from somewhere in the wall by my headboard. I pressed my ear against the drywall, my heart hammering, and it stopped. I stayed up for hours, waiting for it to start again, but it didn't. I was so sleep-deprived the next day that my boss noticed, asking if I was all right. I forced a smile, nodding, but the exhaustion clung to me like a shadow, making everything seem blurry and unreal. The anomalies continued to pile up, small things that felt trivial on their own, but began to weave into a pattern that was hard to ignore. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed a photograph on my nightstand that I'd never seen before. It was the same old Polaroid I'd found weeks ago, only now it was out in the open, staring back at me. This time, I saw myself in the background, barely visible but unmistakably me, standing with the strangers around that bonfire. My heart pounded as I picked it up, my mind scrambling to find an explanation. But there wasn't one. I didn't own a Polaroid camera, and I hadn't been at any bonfire. In a panic, I called my friend Claire and told her everything. I could hear the hesitation in her voice as I spoke, but she tried to sound reassuring, saying I was just stressed and needed a break. She told me to put the photo away, get some sleep, and stopped thinking about it. When I hung up, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was just tired, seeing patterns where there were none. But that night, I woke up to the sound of someone whispering my name. I sat up, heart racing, and scanned the room, but it was empty. I couldn't tell where the voice was coming from, only that it was close, like someone was standing just behind me, speaking directly into my ear. I stayed awake until dawn, the silence pressing in around me like a weight. After that, reality started to slip. I'd be walking down the street and feel like I'd been there before, not just in the normal sense, but with an eerie familiarity, like I'd lived the moment exactly as it was unfolding now. I'd find things in my apartment that weren't mine, books with handwritten notes in the margins, old postcards addressed to people I didn't know. Once, I stumbled across a shoe that wasn't my size or style, sitting in the middle of my living room as though someone had left it there on purpose. I stopped going out as much, convinced people were watching me, that they knew something I didn't. On a rare grocery run, I saw the man from the store again, the one who'd called me Ben. He stared at me, unblinking, and when I tried to turn away, he said, "You need to remember." His voice was cold, almost mechanical. I stumbled back, the world around me feeling twisted and unreal. The final straw came one night when I heard the tapping sound again. This time, I was ready. I grabbed a hammer and struck the wall where the noise was coming from, tearing through the drywall in a frenzy. When the dust settled, I found a small metal box embedded between the studs. With trembling hands, I opened it, expecting, I didn't know what. Inside was a single Polaroid, a newer one this time, with a date printed in the corner. Last week. In the photo, I was asleep in my own bed, the covers pulled up to my chest, my face half hidden by shadows. A chill spread through me as I realized there was a faint reflection in the mirror beside my bed, a figure standing in the doorway, watching. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because when I came to, it was morning and the wall was perfectly intact, no signs of damage. I searched everywhere, but the photo and the box were gone. Now, I'm writing this down because I can't tell what's real anymore. I keep waiting to wake up, hoping it's all just some bizarre dream. But every time I look in the mirror, I feel that familiar tug, like there's something lurking just beyond my memory, a piece of myself I've lost. I don't go out anymore, don't answer my phone. I'm afraid that if I step outside, I'll run into someone who knows me, someone who knows a version of me I don't remember, or worse, someone who's waiting for me to remember them. Every night, I sit in bed, waiting for the tapping to start again, for the sound of my name whispered in the dark. I moved into the place mid-March, a 2-bedroom rental, tucked at the end of a sleepy cul-de-sac, with a backyard that sloped down into a stretch of dense woods. Perfect for a fresh start, I thought. The lease was cheap, the neighborhood quiet, and after a year of crashing on friends' couches, I was thrilled to have space that was finally mine. The first few days went smoothly. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, figuring out which drawers to claim as junk drawers. But there was something about the house that kept tugging at the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't quite scratch. At night, I'd catch myself lying awake, straining to hear something. Anything beyond the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling floors. Then one night, maybe a week in, I woke up to the faint sound of footsteps. At first, I figured it was my own mind playing tricks. I was in a new place, alone, and hadn't yet settled in fully. I pulled the covers up and listened as the sound faded. In the morning, I brushed it off. This place was old, after all. Houses like this creak, they settle, I told myself. But over the next few nights, the footsteps became a little clearer, the intervals a little more rhythmic, almost purposeful. They would start around 3 a.m., moving from the living room to the hallway, pausing just outside my bedroom door. I'd lie frozen, waiting, but eventually they'd fade again, back into silence. One morning after a particularly sleepless night, I decided to take a look around, if only to convince myself there was nothing to worry about. I inspected every corner of the house, looking for loose floorboards or spots that might be catching the wind. But everything seemed fine. On a whim, I checked the backyard. The woods had always given me a strange vibe. but I figured it was just the thick, tangled trees casting shadows. As I walked along the edge of the yard, I noticed something odd, a small, sunken patch of ground near the tree line, like something was buried there. I brushed it off, assuming it was probably an animal den or an old root, and went back inside. Over the next few days, the footsteps continued. Every night, like clockwork, they'd start in the living room, then slowly move down the hallway to my door. One night, desperate to confront whatever was causing it, I flung open the bedroom door, heart pounding, ready to face whoever or whatever was out there. But the hallway was empty, the silence in the house thick and unnerving. Still, I was certain I'd heard something. Eventually, I confided in my sister, hoping she'd laugh and tell me I was just overtired. But instead, she looked at me seriously and suggested I try recording the sounds. So that night, I downloaded a voice recorder app on my phone and set it up on the bedside table. The next morning, I eagerly replayed the recording. There were the footsteps, clear as day, starting soft but growing louder, almost like they were right there in the room with me. Then, faintly, I heard something else. A voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was low, almost like a whisper. My stomach dropped. Maybe it was some kind of interference, I reasoned. Still, I couldn't shake the chill that settled over me. Determined to find an explanation, I did some digging, scouring old news articles to see if anything strange had happened in the area. I found nothing about my house, but stumbled on a vague mention of disappearances in the woods behind my street. Years ago, it seemed a few local kids had gone missing while playing near the tree line. None of them were ever found. A pit formed in my stomach as I recalled the sunken patch of ground in my backyard. The next night, I left the recorder on again. I fell into a restless sleep and, sure enough, woke up around 3 a.m. to the familiar sound of footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at my door. They seemed to linger outside, then move past, down the hall and towards the second bedroom. I listened, every muscle in my body tense, as the footsteps stopped, then started again, coming back toward my door. But this time, they didn't fade away. They stopped right outside, so close I could almost feel the weight of whatever stood there. I held my breath, too terrified to move. Minutes ticked by, and eventually, I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion. In the morning, I checked the recording. The footsteps were there, as loud as I'd heard them. But just after they reached my door, I heard that same low whisper, only clearer this time. It was saying my name. I froze, heart pounding, replaying it over and over, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the recording. But there was no mistaking it. That night, I locked the bedroom door. I knew it was irrational, but it gave me a slight sense of comfort. The footsteps came again, this time stopping outside my door and lingering longer than ever. I could hear the handle jiggle, as if someone or something was testing it. My breath hitched as the door rattled, the sound reverberating in the dark. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. After that night, things escalated. I'd come home to find drawers open, lights flickering, even muddy footprints leading from the back door to the hallway. I could feel myself growing more paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced someone or something was watching me. Finally, after a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I called my sister and asked her to come over, just for one night, so I wouldn't be alone. When she arrived, I felt a wave of relief. We spent the evening watching movies, laughing nervously, trying to brush off the tension that lingered. Eventually, we both fell asleep in the living room, the TV casting a soft glow over the room. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. I glanced over at my sister, who was fast asleep, and listened as the footsteps moved down the hallway. My heart pounded, every nerve on edge, waiting to see what would happen. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and then, in the silence, I heard it, the voice, clearer than ever, unmistakable, whispering my name. It sounded so close, like it was right beside me. I glanced around, my eyes darting over the shadows, but there was no one there. I wanted to wake my sister, but I was frozen, too afraid to move, too afraid to make a sound. In the morning, I checked the recorder. The footsteps were louder than ever, but the whisper wasn't just saying my name. It was saying, "Come outside." I felt a cold wave wash over me as I remembered the sunken spot in the backyard. I didn't want to dig it up, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. My sister offered to go with me, and together, we grabbed a shovel and walked out to the backyard, hearts pounding. We dug down only a few feet before we hit something hard. It was an old metal box, rusted and worn. Inside, we found a collection of photographs. They were old, faded, but I recognized the kids from the newspaper article I'd read, the ones who'd gone missing. And in the last photo, standing just behind the kids, was a figure barely visible but undeniably there. It looked like me. My sister and I stared at each other, too shocked to speak. We closed the box and buried it again, sealing it away. I don't know what it meant or how my face could appear in a photo that was decades old, but we agreed never to speak of it again. I moved out a week later, breaking my lease without a second thought. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get an answer, if some part of me is still lingering there, waiting in that house, watching, whispering in the dark. It started on a Saturday afternoon in October. I was in my little one-bedroom apartment, organizing my bookshelf and trying to ignore the buzz of traffic outside. It was a gloomy day with rain forecasted, but my mood was light. I'd just moved in a few weeks earlier, and everything still felt new and full of possibility. I was excited to make this place my own, to settle in and start fresh. The building was nothing special, a basic, old walk-up, but it had charm, and I loved the way the afternoon light spilled across the hardwood floors, even on an overcast day. As I arranged my books, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was coming from my open window. I leaned out, looked down the street, and saw nothing out of the ordinary. The sound stopped, so I brushed it off as maybe a neighbor on a phone call or someone talking in the hallway. But as I returned to my task, I heard it again. This time, it was clearer, though still muffled, like someone was talking directly through the wall from the other side of the room. "Hello!" I stood perfectly still, trying to place the source. It was such a small voice, almost childlike, but garbled, as if spoken underwater or through static. I shook my head, slightly freaked out, but reasoning that it had to be the pipes or some odd quirk of the old building. Later that night, the whisper was still on my mind as I lay in bed. Just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard the sound again, clearer this time. "Hello!" I froze, my heart racing. The voice wasn't coming from the wall, it was coming from my closet. I was wide awake now, pulse thudding in my ears. This made no sense. It had to be my imagination. It was an old building, probably just creaks and groans settling in for the night, I told myself. But as I lay there in the dark, that feeble voice continued. It was low, distorted, almost a moan. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but I could feel its presence, as if something or someone was standing just on the other side of the closet door. After what felt like hours, the sound finally stopped. I don't know how, but eventually, I managed to fall asleep, though I dreamed of whispering voices and shadowy figures standing at the foot of my bed. The next day, I convinced myself it had been a weird one-off experience, that maybe I was just overtired and letting my imagination run wild. I went about my day, went to work, came home, and tried not to think about it. That night, I closed the closet door tight, as if that could somehow prevent whatever it was from happening again. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a thump. It was loud enough to jolt me out of a dead sleep. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear anything more. Silence. I turned on my bedside lamp and scanned the room. Nothing out of place. The closet door was still closed. I lay back down, but sleep was out of the question now. A few minutes later, another noise, a dragging sound, like someone pulling a heavy sack across the floor. I sat up and stared at the closet. My stomach twisted as I noticed something strange. The doorknob was moving. It was slow and subtle, a gentle turn one way, then back again, as if someone were testing it from the other side. I was paralyzed, too terrified to move. I wanted to scream, but something told me to stay silent, to watch. Slowly, I saw the doorknob stop, and then silence returned. I must have stayed frozen in that position for hours, waiting for the first light of dawn to creep through my window before I dared move again. That day, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was some draft from the hallway that rattled the door. But that explanation didn't sit right. I kept replaying the image of that turning doorknob in my mind, over and over. I decided that night to sleep on the couch in the living room. Maybe the bedroom was colder, draftier. Maybe it was just one of those unsettling noises that older buildings made. The living room would be safer, I told myself. It was farther from the closet, and I could sleep near the main door in case I needed to make a quick exit. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the same low, muffled voice calling out from the bedroom. "Help me!" This time, it sounded desperate, pleading, but in a strange, almost mechanical way, as if someone were playing a recording that was being stretched and slowed down. My blood ran cold. I wanted to cover my ears, but I couldn't move. I felt as if I were pinned to the couch, forced to listen. And then, in the darkness, I heard footsteps, soft, slow, coming from my bedroom and moving toward the living room where I lay. My skin prickled with the cold dread of knowing that whatever this was, it was aware of me. I could hear the steps approaching, a shuffling, dragging sound, as though it were limping or struggling to move. I clutched my phone, debating whether I should call the police or just run out of the apartment right then and there. And then, just as the footsteps reached the doorway of the living room, they stopped. Silence. I was too terrified to turn around, too afraid to see what might be standing there. I kept my eyes shut tight, whispering to myself that it would be over soon, that I was just imagining it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right there, hovering just behind me, watching me. Finally, when the sun rose, I bolted out of the apartment without looking back. I drove to a friend's place and spent the rest of the day there, trying to make sense of everything. My friend suggested I stay with them for a few days, which I did. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in their place. When I finally returned to my apartment, I tried to keep the lights on at all times. I moved my bed out of the bedroom and into the living room, too afraid to sleep near that closet. But even so, every night, I heard that same voice calling out to me, begging for help, growing weaker each time, as if it were fading. It wasn't until one night, several weeks later, that the voice finally stopped. But I wasn't alone. One night, I was lying on the couch, and for the first time in a long time, I felt almost at peace, like whatever had haunted me had finally left. I drifted off to sleep, but just before I fully closed my eyes, I saw something in the corner of the room, an indistinct shadow, not quite human, watching me. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a leftover figment of my mind playing tricks. But in that moment, I realized it was something real, something that had been there all along. The shadow didn't move. It just stayed in the corner watching. When I finally summoned the courage to turn on the light, it was gone. But that's when I knew I had been sharing my apartment with something I couldn't explain, something that was beyond my understanding, beyond reason. I moved out the following week. I don't know what I experienced in that apartment, but I haven't heard that voice since. Sometimes, though, I still wake up in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear a faint whisper just outside the door. I first noticed the change in my favorite cafe on the corner of 5th and Maple. It was one of those places you could rely on. Sturdy wooden tables, handwritten chalkboard menu, the same old barista who always wore a Rolling Stones shirt and remembered my order. It was comforting in its predictability. So when I walked in one Tuesday morning and saw that they'd swapped out the old mismatched chairs for sleek, plastic ones, I was a little thrown. It seemed unnecessary, like they'd taken a piece of something real and replaced it with something that didn't belong. But fine, places update, I told myself. I brushed it off, made my usual order, and settled in with my coffee and laptop. But I noticed the barista kept staring at me. Not in a friendly, I recognize you way, but with an intense, almost angry focus, like I was doing something wrong just by sitting there. The next day, the barista wasn't wearing his usual shirt either. Instead, he had on a plain black polo, no logos, nothing expressive. I commented on it, trying to be friendly. He just gave me a blank stare and muttered, "I don't know you." I laughed, but his face stayed serious, and there was no glimmer of recognition. I went to sit down and realized the chalkboard menu was gone too. In its place was a plain white sign with just the word coffee in blocky, sterile letters. A strange chill went through me. I knew changes like that didn't happen overnight. The place looked the same on the surface, but the vibe was all wrong. Everything was cleaner, too. Too clean, like it had been scrubbed of every unique detail. I left quickly, hoping I was just having an off day. But as the week went on, more little changes cropped up, each one unsettling me in a way I couldn't shake. My street had always had this old, comforting neighborhood vibe. Kids playing, people walking dogs, familiar faces waving hello. But now, every time I stepped outside, there were fewer and fewer people around. The kids were gone, and those who remained seemed to walk with strange, synchronized movements, heads slightly down, no interaction with each other. The neighbors I recognized barely looked at me. When I tried to wave at Mrs. Henson across the street, she only stared right through me, her face blank as a stone. I tried to bring it up with my roommate, Megan, one night. "Hey, have you noticed things feeling off around here?" She didn't look up from her phone. "What do you mean?" "Like places changing. People acting strange?" She shrugged. "You're overthinking it." But I could see her reflection in the window. Her eyes didn't seem to focus on anything, her face disturbingly expressionless. I decided I'd had enough and went to bed early, figuring sleep might put me back in my right headspace. But the next morning, my own apartment seemed wrong, like the air was too heavy, like something was watching me. The photos on my wall looked slightly faded. Even Megan's picture on the fridge seemed off. Her smile was a little too sharp, her eyes a bit too intense. I picked up the frame, staring at it for so long, I almost didn't hear her come up behind me. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice flat. I jumped and muttered something about dusting the photos. She didn't respond, just watched me in silence, her head tilted slightly to the side. I waited for her to laugh it off, to say I was being weird, but she just stood there unblinking. I felt something rise in my throat, a wave of nausea or panic. I couldn't tell which, and I had to leave. At work, things weren't much better. I'd been there for 3 years, knew everyone in my small department. But suddenly, it was like I was invisible. My boss didn't say good morning. Co-workers passed by without acknowledging me. Even my cubicle felt different. My plant was gone, replaced by a spotless white ceramic mug I'd never seen before. I asked Claire, the woman in the next cubicle, if she'd seen anyone move my stuff. She looked up, her eyes glassy. "You don't have a plant." I laughed awkwardly, gesturing to the empty space on my desk. "Yeah, you do." It was right here. She just blinked at me and turned back to her computer. By Friday, I felt like I was drowning in a sea of invisible stares, of movements that were almost human but not quite. Every time I looked away, I could feel them watching. And every time I looked back, there was nothing, just people going about their business, but slower, stranger, like they were imitating real life. I decided to go back to the cafe, hoping the familiar place would ground me. But when I got there, the building was gone, just a vacant lot where it had been. I stood there, trying to remember if I'd somehow gotten the address wrong, but I knew I hadn't. Shaken, I started walking home, passing by shops and people who no longer looked familiar. Every street felt darker, the shadows deeper. I passed a group of men on the corner who turned to stare as I walked by, their faces blank, but their eyes full of something I couldn't name. I picked up my pace, my heart hammering in my chest, and practically ran the last 2 blocks home. When I burst through the door, Megan was standing in the middle of the living room, facing away from me. "Megan," I whispered, but she didn't turn. Her shoulders rose and fell in slow, rhythmic breaths, too slow to be normal. I backed into my room, locking the door behind me, feeling that same wrongness seep into every corner. I didn't sleep that night, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, the silence was unbearable. I opened my door cautiously, finding the apartment empty. Megan's things were still there, but she was gone. I tried calling her, but her number was disconnected. I checked her social media. Her profiles were gone, as if she'd never existed. I was alone. I thought about calling someone, but who would believe me? Everyone around me was either gone or wrong. I left the apartment in a daze, hoping that maybe if I just walked far enough, I'd find something familiar again. As I wandered, the city felt like a maze of mirrors, every building a distorted reflection of what I remembered. People passed me with blank stares, their faces blending into each other. Every shop I tried to enter was locked. Every call I made went straight to a deadline. I even went to my parents' house on the other side of town, but when I got there, it was like they'd never lived there at all. A couple I didn't recognize answered the door, looking at me as if I were insane. "There's no one by that name here," they said in unison, their voices flat. I don't know how long I walked, searching for a way out. Hours? Days? Time didn't feel real anymore. I stopped in front of what used to be the cafe, staring at the empty lot, trying to remember every detail of that place. The chairs, the menu, the barista in his Rolling Stones shirt. I thought if I just concentrated hard enough, I could will it back into existence. But all that stared back was a patch of bare earth. Eventually, I sat down on the edge of the curb, feeling the crushing weight of everything around me, feeling the emptiness sink into my bones. As night fell, I looked up at the darkening city, the hollow, expressionless faces passing by, and realized something that filled me with a kind of cold dread I'd never known. I was the only real thing left here, or maybe I'd been the unreal one all along, and now the world was catching. I just moved into my first solo apartment, a tiny studio on the edge of town, close to some woods and far enough from the noise of the main street that I could hear the river a few blocks away. After years of roommates, I was thrilled at the idea of having my own space. The landlord, an older woman named Marie, had been chatty when I signed the lease. She warned me about the patchy cell service and mentioned that Wi-Fi was spotty, which made me nervous, but I figured it might even be nice to unplug a bit. Plus, the place had these big windows that let in all the morning sun, and the rent was cheap. The first week was all about settling in. I found a couple of local hiking trails and went every morning, loving the quiet and the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. It was on my third hike that I saw him, a man around my age, mid-30s tall, with a scruffy beard and a big camera slung around his neck. He was crouching by a tree, snapping photos of something on the ground. I almost didn't notice him, but he called out as I walked past. "Hey, you're new around here, right?" He smiled, and there was something warm and genuine in it. I smiled back, explaining that I'd just moved in, and he introduced himself as Cal. He said he was a photographer and liked to capture wildlife around the trails. "There aren't many locals who come out here this time of year," he said almost wistfully. We talked for a few minutes, and he recommended a few spots I should check out before the cold weather settled in. As we said goodbye, he raised his camera and gave me a playful salute, saying, "See you around." Over the next few days, I saw Cal several times on my morning hikes, always with his camera, always snapping pictures of the trees or small animals. Each time he'd wave or stop for a bit of small talk, and I started to feel like I had a friend in this quiet, isolated part of town. It was nice, honestly, to see a familiar face. Then one morning he mentioned my apartment. "I noticed you've got that cute plant by your window. The one in the blue pot," he said offhandedly. I froze for a second. My apartment faced the woods, and his comment threw me off. "Yeah," I replied slowly. I put it there to get more light. I didn't want to sound rude, but I wondered how he'd even know that. The woods were dense, and my windows were small, hardly visible from the trails. But he just smiled a little too casually and changed the subject. After that, I noticed small things that didn't feel right. One morning, I found a freshly broken branch right under my window, like someone had been standing there watching. My windows didn't lock very well, and once, when I came home, I found the plant moved a few inches, as if someone had bumped into it. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that maybe I'd left the window open and a breeze had nudged it. But Cal started showing up everywhere, not just on my hikes anymore. I'd see him near the grocery store, outside my apartment complex, even down by the laundromat where I did my washing. Once, I was out running errands when I saw him sitting in his car across the street. He waved and smiled, but his expression was off, like he was watching me closely, memorizing everything I did. One night, I came home late after a long day at work. As I unlocked my door, I got a text from an unknown number. The message read, "You look tired today. Long day?" I felt a chill run down my spine. How could someone have seen me just now, with no one else around? I texted back, "Who is this?" but got no response. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just someone with a wrong number. The next morning, Cal was waiting for me on the trail, leaning against a tree. He looked pleased to see me, like he'd been expecting me. "Long night?" he asked, smirking. My stomach dropped. I hadn't told anyone about the text, but here he was, mentioning it casually. When I asked if he'd messaged me, he laughed, brushing it off. "I wouldn't know your number. Small town, though. Word gets around." The way he looked at me, then, it wasn't friendly, not anymore. His eyes felt too intense, focused in a way that made my skin crawl. I made an excuse to cut my hike short and hurried home, locking the door behind me and checking the windows twice. That evening, just as it was getting dark, I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat. I looked through the peephole, but saw no one. I was about to turn away when I heard Cal's voice through the door, barely a whisper. "You left your curtains open, Sarah. You really shouldn't do that." I backed away, not daring to respond. How did he know I left the curtains open? I hadn't even looked out my windows since coming home. I stayed up all night, unable to shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next morning, I skipped my hike, hoping Cal wouldn't notice. But when I went out to my car later, there was a note on my windshield. "Missed you on the trail." I started locking my door obsessively, double-checking my windows, but it didn't matter. Over the next few days, I kept finding little things moved around in my apartment. A misplaced book, a drawer left half open. One night, I came home to find my front door slightly ajar. Heart pounding, I pushed it open slowly. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but when I checked my fridge, there was a single photo taped to the door. A grainy picture of me sleeping, clearly taken from inside my own apartment. I backed away, my hands shaking, and turned to find another note lying on the floor by the door. "You left your window unlocked." Panicked, I called the police, but they didn't find any signs of forced entry and told me it was likely just a prank. They advised me to get some extra locks, maybe a security camera, and left with sympathetic smiles. I installed every lock I could find and even bought an alarm system, but I didn't feel any safer. Then, one evening, I received another text from the unknown number. "Going to bed early tonight?" This time, I called the number back. I waited, heart pounding, as it rang twice, 3 times, and then someone answered. It was Cal. "You shouldn't be calling strangers this late," he said softly, his voice too calm. I hung up, my hands shaking. That night, I barely slept, clutching a heavy flashlight and listening to every creak and groan of the apartment. The next morning, I decided to leave town. I packed what I could and was ready to go by dawn. As I loaded my bags into the car, I saw Cal watching from his car parked down the street, his camera resting on the dashboard. He didn't try to stop me, didn't even wave. He just watched, a slow smile spreading across his face as I pulled away. I drove for hours, checking the rearview mirror constantly, until I reached my friend's place in a nearby city. I stayed there for a few weeks, trying to forget the look on his face, trying to convince myself that I'd overreacted. But last night, as I was settling into bed, I got another text from that same unknown number. "I'll see you soon, Sarah." And this morning, I found a new plant on my windowsill, one in a blue pot, just like the one I'd left behind. It started with something so small I almost didn't notice: a cup of coffee. I always set my coffee down on the kitchen counter, always in the same spot, close to the edge where I could grab it on my way out. It was a habit so ingrained I hardly thought about it. But that morning, as I reached for the cup without looking, my hand swept through thin air. I looked down, confused, to find the cup a few inches to the left. It was such a minor thing, yet I knew I hadn't put it there. I shrugged it off, chalked it up to my own early morning fogginess, and got on with my day. But I'd barely made it 2 steps before I noticed something else. The small calendar on the fridge that I always used to keep track of the week. The date was right, but the day was wrong. Wednesday had somehow moved to the spot where Thursday should be. I blinked, shook my head, and without thinking much more about it, rearranged the magnets to fix it. Little things like that kept happening. A book that had been left on my desk would be on the coffee table the next time I looked. My car keys would disappear from the hook by the door, only to turn up in the pocket of my coat, which I hadn't even worn that day. I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in the bathroom mirror with my hair slightly different than it had been a second before, or even an odd expression I wasn't making. Each time, I'd laugh it off, or force myself to believe I'd just forgotten. After all, it wasn't as if anyone else was noticing. But then I started seeing people I didn't know everywhere. A tall man in a dark coat seemed to be around every corner. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. He was probably just another neighbor I'd never noticed, just a face in the background of my routine. But then I saw him 4, maybe 5 times in one morning alone, waiting in line ahead of me at the coffee shop, sitting across from me on the subway, even walking right past me in the lobby of my office building. I'd see his face in the crowd, and my heart would skip a beat. I could swear he was staring, his gaze lingering just a bit too long. One night, as I walked home, I passed him again, leaning against a lamppost a few blocks from my apartment. I felt an odd urge to approach him, to ask him what he was doing here, but the words caught in my throat, replaced by a strange feeling that I already knew the answer. He didn't seem like he belonged anywhere specific, just a figure in the background of my life. The oddest part? I'd started to accept him, this random stranger, as part of my days, like the misplaced items and wrong dates. He was just another thing that didn't make sense, yet somehow felt routine. Then, the next morning, I walked into my living room and found all my furniture rearranged. I froze in the doorway, staring at my own belongings like they belonged to someone else. The couch was angled toward the window instead of the television. My coffee table was on the opposite side of the room, and even the rug had been rotated. I was sure I hadn't moved anything. I would never rearrange my furniture so drastically. Yet for some reason, a part of me just shrugged it off. I told myself I was probably just tired, that I'd forgotten doing it in a fit of late-night impulse. I wasn't even scared anymore. It was just another oddity in the increasing list of glitches that had somehow wormed their way into my life. Over time, I started to notice other changes. Words on street signs would blink in and out of existence, or sometimes they'd be misspelled in strange ways. Elm Street would briefly become Elm Street before shifting back. The streetlights on my walk home would flicker in the same sequence every night, almost like Morse code. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. And yet, it was oddly comforting in the same way that the glitches had become comforting, like the disruption was becoming the norm. One day, I saw myself, not my reflection, another version of me, sitting on the bus a few rows ahead. She wore the same clothes as I did, had the same messy hair tied back, and even tapped her foot with that same nervous rhythm I did when I was anxious. I stared, frozen, unable to look away. She turned, and our eyes met for a split second before she looked down at her phone, seemingly unaware of the connection we'd just made. I wanted to approach her, to say something, but the bus lurched to a stop, and she slipped out the back door. I sat there, hands trembling, realizing that something had shifted in a way that wasn't just strange, but wrong. I had no logical way to explain it. Yet the sight of her left me feeling like I'd looked behind the curtain of my own life, and what I'd seen couldn't be unseen. The next day, I found a photograph on my bedside table that I didn't remember taking. It was me sitting on the edge of my bed, looking straight into the camera. The background was my room, exactly as it was in that moment, right down to the mismatched socks on the floor and the cup of half-finished tea on my nightstand. I held the picture, staring at my own face. My eyes looked blank, almost empty. A chill ran down my spine as I realized there was no one else in the room who could have taken it. Yet, when I glanced at the teacup next to me, it was still warm. After that, time started to feel strange. Days blended together, and I lost track of whether I was dreaming or awake. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find the clock blinking a random string of numbers that didn't make sense. My phone showed missed calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years, only to have the records disappear the next time I looked. I'd receive texts from myself with messages like, "Don't forget," and "You're almost there," but whenever I tried to reply, the conversation thread would vanish. Each time, I'd feel a creeping sense of resignation rather than fear. It was as if I'd started to expect the impossible. Reality was no longer fixed. It was malleable, bending and shifting around me. One morning, I woke up and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd gone outside. My apartment felt like the only safe place, though even here, objects kept appearing and disappearing at random. I'd sit at my kitchen table, waiting for something to happen, feeling more like an observer in my own life than a participant. The man in the dark coat still appeared from time to time, always at a distance, watching. I no longer had the urge to approach him. Instead, I felt like he was there for a reason I didn't fully understand, yet it didn't matter. I couldn't remember what life had been like before all this began, and a part of me no longer cared. Then one day, I looked into the bathroom mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. They looked like me, but their eyes held a detachment, a hollowness that felt foreign, even to me. For the first time in what felt like forever, a spike of panic surged through me. I reached up to touch the glass, hoping for some proof that I was still real, that my reflection was still me. But when my fingers brushed the mirror, it rippled like water. I gasped, pulling my hand back, watching as my reflection melted away into a blurred, faceless shape. I stood there, staring, trying to remember if I'd ever felt anything other than this unending sense of déjà vu. Slowly, a realization settled over me. I was trapped. Whatever this world was, however it operated, I was now a part of it, a fixture within its glitches. I had crossed some invisible line, and there was no going back. The life I'd once known felt like a distant memory, something half-forgotten, like a dream slipping away with the dawn. I had become a ghost in my own reality, destined to live within the glitches, forever shifting, forever uncertain. It started with small things I brushed off as quirks of living alone. A pair of socks vanished from the dryer, then reappeared 2 days later, crumpled up in the back of my closet. A light bulb in the hallway burned out, though I'd only replaced it a week ago. Harmless enough, right? But then other things started happening. My coffee mug, always set down on the kitchen counter in the morning, would sometimes be in the living room instead. I'd laugh it off, thinking I must have been absent-minded. But it kept happening. Items would disappear only to show up somewhere else, slightly out of place but close enough to be reasonable, at least at first. One evening, I came home from work and noticed something strange. The silverware drawer was open, just a couple of inches, and a spoon lay on the floor halfway across the kitchen. I remembered closing the drawer that morning. I brushed it off, figuring it might have slid open on its own. But I couldn't ignore the fact that the spoon, a heavy metal one, lay far from the drawer. It didn't make sense, but I shrugged it off and put it away. The following night, though, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. I lay in bed, my heart racing as I tried to figure out where it was coming from. It was soft, almost like someone was tapping their fingers against wood. After a few moments, it stopped, and I convinced myself it was the pipes. But every few nights, I'd hear it again, and every time, it felt just a little closer to my bedroom. Then I started noticing odd marks around the apartment. Faint smudges on the walls, like greasy fingerprints, though I'd always wiped them down. Once, I found a thin scratch on my coffee table. It was subtle, just a line that hadn't been there before. I'd run my hand along it, wondering if maybe I'd done it without realizing. But they kept appearing, little scuffs and scratches on furniture and walls, all in places where I knew there'd been nothing before. I told a friend about it, hoping to laugh it off together, but she just chuckled and said, "Sounds like you've got a poltergeist. Or maybe a rat." I forced a laugh, but didn't feel comforted. I wasn't imagining this. I kept thinking that, repeating it to myself every time I saw a new mark, a misplaced object. I knew my own home. I knew these weren't accidents or my own mistakes. One night, things took a darker turn. I'd been lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I felt something under my pillow. I reached underneath and pulled out a small, rusty key. It was unfamiliar, old-fashioned, with a heavy iron ring that didn't look like anything I owned. I lay there staring at it, my mind racing, trying to remember if I'd seen it somewhere in my apartment before. I hadn't. It was dirty, almost grimy, as if it had been buried or hidden away for years. How it ended up under my pillow, I couldn't imagine. The next day, I put the key in a drawer in the kitchen, but later, I found it on the living room table. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It looked the same as before, but now there was something unsettling about it, like I shouldn't be holding it. I dropped it back into the drawer, but a few days later, I found it lying in the center of my bed. By this point, my nerves were on edge. I'd catch myself checking my apartment for new scratches or misplaced items, wandering from room to room like I was looking for something I'd lost. I even started locking my bedroom door at night, trying to feel safer. But then the dreams started. They were all the same, vague and unsettling, leaving me with a sense of dread when I woke. I'd be standing in my living room, looking at a shadow in the corner. It was more of an absence than a presence, an empty patch of darkness that shouldn't have been there. I tried to turn on the lights, but they wouldn't work, and I'd feel something watching me, though I never saw eyes or a face. Just that shadow, looming and silent. The next morning, I woke up and found that every single cabinet in my kitchen was open. All the drawers, too, gaping like they'd been pulled out by impatient hands. Nothing was missing, nothing was damaged. It was as if someone had been looking for something and had left in a hurry. I stood there for what felt like ages, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. I'd locked the bedroom door. How could anyone have been in here? I started noticing other things too. My phone battery would drain unexpectedly. Lights would flicker, and I'd feel strange cold spots in random parts of the apartment. I started keeping the lights on at night, even in my bedroom. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then came the night I woke up and saw something standing in the hallway. I couldn't make it out clearly, just a tall, dark figure, its form barely visible in the dim light. I felt my breath catch, my chest tightening with a mix of terror and disbelief. I blinked, and it was gone. I lay there, heart hammering, unable to move, unable to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. I knew what I'd seen. I was sure of it. The next morning, I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend, telling her I needed a break. She laughed, assumed I was just burnt out, but she let me stay. That night, I felt safe for the first time in weeks. I fell asleep easily, but when I woke up, my heart dropped. The rusty key was on the pillow beside me. I hadn't brought it with me. I was sure of it. I'd left it in the drawer in my apartment. My hands shook as I picked it up, feeling its rough, gritty texture. My friend asked if I was okay, and I managed a weak smile, shoving the key into my pocket. I told her everything, hoping that saying it out loud would make it sound silly. But she just looked at me, concerned, and suggested I go back to my apartment to face my fear. That wasn't an option. Not anymore. I rented a storage unit and packed up my things. A week later, I was in a new apartment on the other side of town. I felt a sense of relief, like I'd left something behind, but the key haunted me. I'd thrown it away, dropped it into a sewer grate the night I moved out, but sometimes I'd wake up with the sense that it was near me, just out of reach. One night, I even had a nightmare that I was holding it in my hand, turning it over and over as something whispered in my ear. Months passed, and I slowly forgot. Life resumed a kind of normalcy. But last night, I heard tapping again, faint and steady, coming from the walls. I lay still, straining to hear, and felt that familiar chill settle over me. The taps grew louder, closer, like they were right beside my bed. It all started with a simple smile, the kind of quick, polite smile you give someone you pass in the hallway. I'd seen the man before. He'd moved into the unit 2 doors down from mine a few weeks earlier. Average-looking guy, maybe mid-30s, dark hair, a bit taller than me. He wore those wire-rimmed glasses that make you look like you're trying to appear smart, but unassuming. I didn't think much of it at first. People moved in and out of my building all the time, and we were all pretty friendly without ever actually knowing each other. But then he introduced himself. I was checking my mail one evening, flipping through bills and junk, when I felt someone watching me. I looked up, and there he was standing a bit too close, that same strange, almost too friendly smile on his face. Im Grek. I just moved in down the hall, he said, holding out his hand. I hesitated but figured I'd be neighborly and shook it. Nice to meet you, I replied, giving a quick nod and trying to get back to my mail. But Greg lingered, his gaze fixed on me, waiting. So, what do you do? He asked. Innocent enough question, sure, but his eyes didn't leave mine the whole time, as if he was searching for something. I told him I worked in marketing, leaving it vague, but that seemed to fascinate him. Marketing, huh? That must be interesting. Do you like it? He asked as if we were in the middle of some deep, personal discussion. I nodded, mumbling a polite, yeah, it's good. I thought that would be the end of it, but he kept going. Do you get up early? I mean, for your job? He asked, leaning a little closer, like he was confiding in me. I laughed awkwardly. Yeah, I guess. Not too early. Why? He shrugged, finally looking away, but only for a moment. Just curious. I'm still figuring out my schedule and, getting used to the neighborhood. Nice meeting you, though. He smiled again, this time wider, his eyes squinting like he was trying too hard. Over the next few days, I'd see Greg in random spots around the building. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. I'd be coming home from work, and he just happened to be coming down the stairwell, or I'd run into him at the mailbox again, or leaving the laundry room. Once or twice, he'd pop up in the lobby when I was leaving in the morning, holding his phone and pretending to be on a call, but watching me through the corner of his eye. I brushed it off, thinking he was just one of those overly friendly types who hadn't yet figured out boundaries. But then one Saturday, I was taking out the trash when I caught him standing in the hallway in front of my door. I stopped, trash bag in hand, and stared at him. "Oh," he said, jumping back a bit. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. I was just wondering if you, have a wrench?" My sink's acting up. Something about the way he was just standing there, waiting for me to come out, made my skin crawl. But I forced a smile and told him I didn't have one. He laughed it off, but he lingered, looking like he wanted to say more. Finally, he muttered a quick, "See you around," before heading down the hall. After that, things escalated, slowly but noticeably. One night, I came home late from work and saw a shadow move near my door. As I got closer, I realized it was Greg. He was sitting on the floor by his door, his head resting against the wall, eyes half closed like he'd been waiting there for hours. When he noticed me, he jumped up, brushing his hair back with an embarrassed smile. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, his voice too soft, almost whispery. "I was just locked out and didn't want to bother anyone." I nodded, feeling my heart pick up, but forced myself to stay calm. "Maybe you should call the landlord next time?" I suggested, keeping my tone light. He grinned, as if I'd told some kind of joke. "Yeah, maybe." I could feel his eyes on me as I unlocked my door and went inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the building made me jump, and I started double-checking my locks. A few days later, I found a note slipped under my door. It was handwritten, messy, with only 3 words. "Can we talk?" No name, no explanation, just that. I held the note, my mind racing, but I knew exactly who had left it. I folded it up, telling myself he was just awkward, maybe a little lonely, and this was his weird way of making friends. I threw the note away and tried to ignore the unsettling feeling. But it didn't stop. Every few days, I'd find little things, my doormat slightly out of place, as if someone had lifted it up and then set it down again. I started noticing faint fingerprints smudged on my door handle, greasy, almost invisible. Once, I even heard a faint knock at my door in the middle of the night. Just one knock, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. One evening, I decided to confront him, to put an end to whatever game he thought he was playing. I saw him by the mailboxes, and he smiled as I walked up. "Hey, Greg," I said, my voice a little too sharp. "I've been meaning to ask. Have you been leaving notes under my door?" He blinked, his expression blank, then broke into that familiar too friendly grin. "Notes? No, of course not. Why would I do that?" He chuckled, but his eyes didn't match the laughter. "I mean, why would I leave a note? You're right here, aren't you?" Something about the way he said it, that slight emphasis on right here, made my stomach twist. I wanted to walk away, to pretend I hadn't asked, but he reached out and gently placed a hand on my arm, stopping me. "Hey, don't worry. If you ever need anything, I'm just down the hall. Day or night, you know. That's what neighbors are for." I nodded, pulling my arm away, mumbling an excuse to get back to my apartment. Once I was inside, I locked the door, my hands shaking. I tried calling a friend, hoping talking to someone would make me feel better, but they didn't pick up. I sat on my couch, staring at the door, listening for any sound from the hallway. The next day, I went out to grab coffee, trying to clear my head. But when I got back, something felt wrong. My door was closed, but it looked like the latch had been tampered with. Just a tiny scratch near the lock that hadn't been there before. I told myself I was being paranoid, but as I walked inside, I froze. My living room window was open. I never left it open. I searched the apartment, heart pounding, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that maybe he'd been there. I called the landlord, asked about the locks, but they just brushed it off, saying they hadn't seen any signs of forced entry. The next night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Soft, deliberate stopping right outside my door. I held my breath, barely daring to move, but after a few seconds, the footsteps continued down the hall. I lay awake, wondering if he'd been watching, waiting, listening. I started looking for a new apartment the next morning, unwilling to stay another day. But as I was leaving, I saw him one last time, standing by his door, watching me with that same unsettling smile. "Moving out so soon?" he asked, his voice low. "I thought we were just getting to know each other." I didn't respond, just walked away, feeling his eyes on my back until I turned the corner. I never found out what he really wanted, if he was just lonely or something far worse. But I knew one thing for sure: whatever his intentions, I'd been right to trust my instincts. There's something surreal about standing in line at the DMV the day after someone's broken your heart. That's where I was, staring at the overhead fluorescent lights, while an old man in a Hawaii 1992 t-shirt barked at a woman in a tired-looking cardigan. They were arguing over some forms, but their voices were muffled in my head like I was underwater. It was early December, and the air outside was bitingly cold, the kind of cold that made your breath disappear as soon as it left your lips. In here, though, it was a stale, artificial warmth, only adding to the nausea that hadn't left me since last night. By the time I got to the front of the line, my stomach was churning. The woman at the counter glanced at me with the glazed-over look of someone who'd been dealing with impatient people all day. "Next," she called, not looking up. I stepped forward and handed her my paperwork, my fingers numb from clutching it so tightly. She sighed, stamped my form, and handed it back without so much as a glance in my direction. That was fine. I wasn't looking for eye contact, just a formality to check off my list. Another little chore in the wasteland of days that stretched out before me now. I took my seat in the waiting area, and a man sat down beside me, folding himself into the seat like he'd been poured into it, his long limbs collapsing like a marionette without strings. He leaned over to me, whispering conspiratorially, "You ever notice how everyone here looks like they lost something?" I stared at him, caught off guard. He looked at me with a half-smile, his eyes crinkling at the edges like he was in on a joke I hadn't been told. I said, struggling to sound normal. "I guess. Maybe a little." I looked around, noticing for the first time that, yes, most people here did look defeated in some way. Furrowed brows, slumped shoulders, the look of people who'd had a rough go of it, but didn't have the luxury to wallow. "I lost my job last month," he continued, almost to himself. "Came here to update my address. Figured it was better than just sitting at home, staring at the walls." "I get that," I replied quietly, though I hadn't lost my job. I'd lost something else, something more intangible, but somehow more devastating. He looked at me as if sensing this, his eyes softening. "Heartbreak?" I froze. "How'd you—" "Doesn't take a psychic to know that look," he said, a bit of sadness creeping into his smile. "I wore it once, maybe twice." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that seemed to come from somewhere outside myself. "Yeah, well, I don't think I wear it well." "You'd be surprised," he said, leaning back. "Heartbreak looks good on most people. Gives them character." I wanted to argue with him, to tell him how absurd it was to think that anything about heartbreak could be good. But instead, I just nodded, staring down at the scuffed tiles. It was true that I felt different, like there was an edge to me now that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a comfortable feeling, but it was sharp and raw, a reminder that I was still alive, even if it hurt. As I sat there, something strange happened. I found myself talking, really talking, to this stranger about things I hadn't even told my closest friends. I told him about the breakup, about the way it happened suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch, leaving me stumbling in the dark. I told him about the plans we'd made, the holidays I'd spent imagining a future that would never come to pass. And he listened, nodding along, his face a mask of understanding. "My ex," he said when I finally stopped, "used to say I was too much. Always felt like I had to hold back, rein myself in, but you know what I figured out?" "What?" "There's no such thing as too much. There's just too much for them." He paused, his gaze distant. "And sometimes, when you stop holding yourself back, you realize that the problem wasn't you. It was that you were trying to fit into a life that was too small. His words settled over me like snowflakes drifting down in slow motion. It was something I'd never considered. I'd spent so much time shrinking myself, trying to fit into what I thought they wanted, that I'd forgotten what it was like to just be me. I guess I just thought. I trailed off, searching for the right words. I thought they were the one, the person I was supposed to be with. He nodded, but there was a hint of something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding that felt deeper than mere agreement. "You know what the trick is?" he asked, leaning closer. "What?" "You're the one." He shrugged, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "People come and go. They make an impact, sure, but you're the one who's always there. The one who has to pick up the pieces, keep moving forward. In the end, you're the only one who can save yourself." The words were simple, but they hit me with the force of a revelation. Maybe he was right. Maybe I'd been looking for someone else to fill in the gaps, to make me feel whole. But all along, I'd had the power to do that for myself. I'd just been too afraid to try. We sat in silence after that, each lost in our thoughts. It was strange how comfortable the silence felt, like we'd somehow managed to reach an understanding without needing to say anything more. For the first time since the breakup, I felt something close to peace. It was fleeting, like a shadow passing over my heart, but it was there, a small glimmer of hope. When my number was finally called, I stood up, giving him a small smile. "Thanks for the talk. I really needed that." He nodded, that same half-smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Anytime. Maybe I'll see you around." As I walked away, I felt lighter, like some invisible weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The rest of the day passed in a haze, and by the time I got home, the nausea was gone. I stood in my apartment, looking around at the familiar space, and felt a strange sense of belonging. That night, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. I thought of the stranger at the DMV, his quiet words of wisdom lingering in my mind. He was right. In the end, it was up to me, and for the first time, that didn't feel scary. It felt possible. I took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the tea seep through my hands, grounding me in the present. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, covering the city in a soft, quiet blanket of white. It was December, after all, a time for endings but also for beginnings. And as I watched the snow fall, I felt something inside me start to mend. I lost my keys. It seemed like a simple thing. I had them when I came home from work. I distinctly remember hearing them clink when I dropped them on the kitchen counter. But later that night, when I got ready to go back out to pick up dinner, they were gone. I searched everywhere, retracing my steps, but it was as if they'd vanished into thin air. Frustrating, but not supernatural. Just annoying. The next day they were back, right there on the kitchen counter, exactly where I remembered leaving them. I chalked it up to my own distraction, told myself I'd probably overlooked them the night before, and tried to move on. But something still felt off. There was a faint, nagging sensation in the back of my mind, like I'd missed a detail just out of reach, something important. I shook it off and headed to work, determined not to obsess over something so small. But then it happened again. Not with the keys, but with my phone. One minute I was texting a friend on my lunch break. The next it was gone. I searched my office, tore through my desk drawers, even retraced my steps to the cafeteria. Nola. And just like the keys, my phone reappeared later. This time, sitting on top of my computer monitor as if it had been there all along. My coworker, Sarah, walked by as I picked it up, saying, "Didn't you just check there?" I laughed it off, feeling a strange prickling unease but trying to shake it. I told myself it was just stress or burnout, the kind of thing that happens when you're working too many hours. The next day, it got weirder. People I'd spoken to the day before acted like they'd never had those conversations. My manager, Tom, gave me a look like I'd lost my mind when I brought up a project we discussed at length not 12 hours ago. "We haven't talked about that," he insisted, laughing it off like it was some kind of joke. "I think I'd remember that, don't you?" I forced a smile, telling myself he was probably just playing around, but it felt forced, uneasy. By the end of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was actually losing it. The following day, things went from strange to surreal. People I'd known for years, co-workers and neighbors, would stop mid-conversation, staring at me blankly before picking up as if nothing had happened. At one point, I was talking to Sarah about weekend plans when she just froze, mouth hanging open as her eyes went unfocused. It was only for a few seconds, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. When she came back, she acted like nothing had happened, talking like we'd been chatting normally the whole time. And then things began disappearing again. Not just small items this time, whole conversations, events, people. I tried to talk to my friend Derek about our plans for a concert next week, only for him to look at me like I was insane. "I don't know any concert," he said, frowning like he was trying to understand a language he didn't speak. I even showed him the texts on my phone, only for them to vanish as I scrolled. It was as if the messages had never been sent. My sense of reality started slipping. I'd go to work in the morning, only to arrive and find the office empty. No emails, no messages, no one there at all. Then, by mid-afternoon, everyone would suddenly reappear as if they'd been there the whole time, acting surprised when I asked where they'd gone. Sarah laughed it off, telling me I was just daydreaming too hard, but I could see something in her eyes, a flash of, I don't know, pity? Fear? It was there and gone too quickly to be sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was saying. One night, desperate for answers, I called my mom. I tried to explain everything, my voice cracking as I told her about the missing keys, the vanishing texts, the blank looks. "I feel like I'm going crazy, Mom," I whispered, clutching the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. There was silence on the other end, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I'd lost her too. Then, finally, she spoke, but her voice was soft, distant, like she was talking from another room. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said, and there was something strange in her tone, something I couldn't quite place. "But I don't know who you are." The line went dead. I sat in the dark, staring at my phone, my mind blank with shock. The next day, I went into work determined to get some kind of explanation, some assurance that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I arrived, the office was different. My desk was gone. My nameplate was gone. Sarah, Tom, everyone, they were all still there, going about their day, as usual, but no one seemed to recognize me. I stood there, watching, feeling like a ghost in my own life. Desperate, I tried talking to Sarah, but she gave me a confused look, muttering, "Sorry, I think you have the wrong person," before walking away. I tried Derek next, but he just stared at me, his expression blank and uncomprehending, before turning his back on me and resuming his conversation with someone else. Days passed, and I was left in this bizarre limbo, watching my life unfold from a distance. I went back to my apartment, only to find the locks had been changed, my belongings gone. I couldn't contact anyone. My phone had become a dead weight, useless in my hand. Every attempt to reach out, to explain, was met with confusion or outright dismissal. People who had once been my friends, my family, treated me like a stranger, like I was the one who didn't belong. In a final act of desperation, I went to the coffee shop I used to visit every weekend. I figured that maybe, just maybe, some familiarity would ground me. But when I walked in, the barista looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded, as if she'd never seen me before. I wanted to scream, to grab her shoulders and shake her, make her remember. Instead, I just stood there, feeling an overwhelming sense of isolation settle over me like a thick fog. I turned to leave, but just before I stepped out the door, I heard her murmur something under her breath. "She's almost gone now." I whipped around, but she was staring at her register, her face a perfect mask of indifference, like she hadn't spoken at all. I stumbled out into the street, my heart pounding, and as I looked around, I realized I didn't recognize anything. Buildings that should have been familiar were subtly different, like someone had rearranged them when I wasn't looking. Street signs were misspelled, colors were off, and the people, they looked normal, but there was something hollow in their eyes, a blankness that made my skin crawl. Now, as I write this, I can feel myself slipping further. People look through me like I'm not there at all. I don't know what's happening, whether I'm disappearing or being erased, but I can feel it, this fading, this sense that I'm dissolving into nothing. I try to tell myself it's all in my head, that I'll wake up any moment and find myself back in my bed, safe and whole. But the worst part is, I don't remember what my bed looks like. I don't remember my apartment, my mother's face. Even my own name feels foreign, like it belongs to someone else. All I know is that whatever I was, whoever I was, I'm not anymore. I'm just a shadow, a fragment drifting through a world that no longer remembers me. And soon, I fear I won't remember it either. I moved into my apartment almost 5 years ago. Small, but clean and just enough for me. Close to work with a decent landlord. Everything was predictable, stable, the way I liked it. But lately it's been off. And by off, I don't mean the pipes rattle a little more or the neighbors are louder than usual. I mean that something is wrong with me. The first time it happened, I was cooking. I've been listening to music on my phone, stirring something on the stove. I could remember humming along to the song, the beat, the words. Then I blinked and my phone was dead in my hand. The song had stopped, my pan was empty, and I was just standing there. The stove was off. It was like the music had jumped to silence, as if someone had cut the sound and flipped a switch in my mind at the exact same time. When I checked the time, 40 minutes had vanished. I chalked it up to zoning out, but it didn't feel like that. It felt as if someone had lifted me out of my own life and dropped me back in when they were done with whatever they'd borrowed me for. Days went by, and I kept brushing it off. But that sense of being watched, being studied, grew. It wasn't a feeling of being observed by someone outside, more like being scrutinized from somewhere deep within myself. And then things started happening that I couldn't dismiss. I went to bed one night after a long shift, exhausted, barely remembering to set my alarm. The last thing I remember is curling up, closing my eyes, then a flash of waking up, looking at the clock. It was 4 a.m, and not my usual sleepy, check the time, wake up, but wide awake, as if I hadn't been asleep at all. I don't remember turning off my alarm, but somehow I was dressed, ready to go outside. Shoes on, jacket zipped, like I'd gotten up and decided on a night walk without any reason to. I could still smell the damp outside air on my clothes, a faint trace of mud on my shoes, even though I didn't remember setting foot out of my apartment. In the mornings, I'd find notes written in my handwriting. They were cryptic and random, like, "I'm sorry I can't control it," or "Find where they hide it." Each one was dated and signed with my own name. I didn't remember writing any of them, yet the letters were unmistakably mine. They looked deliberate, neatly organized as if written in a moment of clarity, but there was something off about them, something almost panicked beneath the tidiness. Things started disappearing. My keys, my wallet, sometimes my phone just for an hour or so, as if they decided to take a break. Once I found my watch sitting on top of the refrigerator. I'd never put anything up there. I'm not even sure how I managed to reach it. Another day, I found my coffee mug balanced on the top of the bathroom mirror, high and precarious. Small things misplaced and left in absurd spots. Each time, there'd be that feeling of blankness, of time lost. A week after that, my best friend Marcus came over to check in on me after I hadn't replied to his messages for days. I swear I hadn't seen any notifications, hadn't heard the phone ring. But when he showed up, he looked confused. He told me I'd been answering him just fine, sending normal replies. He even showed me the texts, words and phrases I could have written but had no memory of typing. The messages were eerie. They sounded like me, but hollow, like someone trying to imitate me by piecing together phrases they'd overheard. Marcus asked me if I was okay, and I found myself telling him everything was fine. He didn't need to worry about me. I remember the words coming out, polite and reassuring, but in my head, I was screaming to tell him the truth. I needed help, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. The episodes grew longer. I'd wake up in strange places. One time at a park 2 miles from my apartment. Another time in a grocery store staring blankly at a shelf of cereal. I'd find items I didn't remember buying. A strange-looking coat 2 sizes too big. A set of keys that didn't fit anything in my apartment. An old paperback with a torn cover. I kept asking myself what I'd done, where I'd been, but the answers never came. I even tried recording myself at night, hoping to catch something. The footage was unsettling. Hours of me sleeping, then at some point, my body would just sit up. My eyes open but blank, unseeing. I'd stand, sometimes pacing the room, sometimes just staring off into the dark corners as if waiting for something. Watching the footage gave me chills. There was something wrong about the way I moved. Not robotic, not unnatural, just empty, like a marionette without a puppeteer. I'd walk out of frame, disappearing from my own view, and then reappear hours later, lying back down like nothing had happened. But the worst part was the ending of each recording. Right before it shut off, I'd lean close to the camera, looking directly at it with my own face, yet something was missing. Like it wasn't really me staring back, but something else wearing my skin. One night, Marcus came over again. This time, he looked scared. He told me he'd received another message from me. It said, "Don't come back." I don't remember sending it, didn't even have the message in my phone's history. He showed me the text again, and it was identical to my writing, down to the usual misspellings I make when I'm in a rush. He begged me to get help, but I couldn't. I didn't even know what was happening or if I could trust anyone, least of all myself. Last night, I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. I had a memory, a strange, distorted image of looking into a mirror, but my reflection didn't move when I did. It just stood there watching, smiling in a way that I would never smile, something cruel and mocking, as if it knew something I didn't. I looked down at my hands, at fingers that were shaking uncontrollably. I had a sense of something crawling under my skin, something writhing and shifting just beneath the surface, trying to take over. I could feel it now, more and more, this presence, this thing that seemed to be using me, learning from me, slipping in and out like a shadow, leaving only questions and missing hours behind. I don't know how much longer I can go on like this. I feel as if something is waiting for the right moment, gathering pieces of me, observing, calculating. It feels as though there's a line I haven't crossed yet, a final barrier that once crossed, I won't come back from. There are more notes every day now. Just let go, one of them said this morning. And the terrifying part is I think I know what it means. I'm writing this down while I still feel normal, or as normal as I can be. I'm afraid that tomorrow, or maybe even in a few hours, I won't remember this. I don't know what's controlling me, or if there's even anything left to control. All I know is that I am being replaced slowly and completely by something that wears my face but isn't me. Maybe it's already too late. It started on a Tuesday, and I remember it was raining, though the downpour felt strange, somehow unreal. I just stepped out of a meeting, late in the day, mentally bracing myself for the wet walk home, when I bumped into a stranger in the lobby. He looked familiar, but not in the way you'd expect. He was tall, maybe in his late 40s, with salt and pepper hair, sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me, and a wry half-smile like he was in on a joke I wasn't privy to. As we passed each other, he put a hand on my shoulder, stopping me. "Hey, I know you from somewhere," he said with a chuckle. There was something disorienting in the way he spoke. I looked at him, trying to place the face, but his features seemed to shift under the fluorescent lights. The contours of his jaw softened, and his eyes turned a deeper shade of brown, no, almost black. I felt a weird prickling sensation, like I was remembering a dream I'd already forgotten. "You're mistaken," I replied, pulling my coat around me. But he just gave me that smile again, the one that made my skin crawl, and said, "Don't worry, we'll see each other again." On the walk home, I tried to shake the encounter, chalking it up to one of those strange urban experiences you shrug off and move on from. But the next morning, my alarm didn't go off. When I checked my phone, it showed 10:43 a.m., though I could have sworn I'd just gone to bed a few hours ago. My body ached, like I hadn't rested at all. I glanced around my room and felt a strange displacement, as if someone had been there in my sleep. The days began to feel surreal after that, slipping through my fingers in unpredictable ways. By Friday, I was exhausted, barely able to keep track of time. I'd look at the clock, blink, and 2 hours would pass as if I'd blacked out. Sometimes I'd find myself in random places without a clear idea of how I'd gotten there. Once in the break room, staring blankly at the coffee maker. Another time in the stairwell, unsure if I was going up or down. My phone started glitching too. I'd see notifications pop up, messages from unknown numbers saying, "Don't forget me," or "We've met before." But when I went to open them, they vanished. That weekend, I took a walk in the park to try to clear my head. I needed to feel grounded, connected to something. The path was quiet, lined with bare trees, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. That's when I saw him again. The same man from the lobby, except he looked younger this time, his hair a deep brown without any gray. He was sitting on a bench, flipping through an old book. He glanced up and smiled that same unsettling smile. "Hey, friend," he greeted me as if we'd known each other for years. "You're still here? Do I know you?" I asked, though the words felt hollow as they left my mouth. He tilted his head, his eyes bright and uncomfortably familiar. "You will," he replied, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "I told you we'd meet again." I stumbled back, feeling a dizzying sensation, like my entire sense of self was tilting. Without saying anything else, I turned and walked away, quickening my pace until I was nearly running. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the bench was empty. That night, my dreams were vivid, violent, and strangely nostalgic. I saw him in fragments, in places I hadn't been in years. An old family restaurant, my high school's gymnasium, a hospital room I didn't recognize. Every time, he wore a different expression: anger, sadness, pity. And with each dream, the memories felt real, but wrong, like I was inhabiting someone else's life. By the time I woke up, drenched in sweat, I had no idea what was real anymore. The following Monday, I decided to work from home. I needed a break, a reset, something to help me make sense of the strange shifts happening around me. But as I sat at my desk, I glanced up and nearly jumped out of my skin. The man was standing on the sidewalk outside, watching me through the window. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, but when I looked again, he was gone. I needed answers, so I reached out to a therapist. She listened as I tried to explain the gaps in my memory, the hours I seemed to lose, the unsettling presence of this man who appeared to know me better than I knew myself. She nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes, and when I mentioned his shifting appearance, she looked up. "How long have you been noticing these discrepancies?" she asked, her voice level. I told her about the past week, how everything had changed since that encounter in the lobby. She looked at me with a strange expression, a mix of pity and alarm. "That's quite recent," she murmured. "Often, symptoms like these take years to develop." "Symptoms?" I repeated, the words slicing through me with a coldness I didn't understand. She smiled softly. "I've heard of cases like yours, where people's memories start fragmenting, where time and identity blur. But those are usually long-term effects, often found in cases of severe trauma or," she paused, her eyes flickering to something behind me. I turned to follow her gaze, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, her expression had changed, her face a little fuller, her eyes a darker shade of blue. She looked different. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. I backed out of the office, heart pounding, barely muttering a goodbye. Outside, the city lights were too bright, casting odd shadows that felt alive, shifting as if they knew I was watching. Over the next few days, my life unraveled. My friends and family seemed distant, and when I spoke to them, they acted like we hadn't talked in ages. My mother asked why I hadn't called in months, though I'd just spoken to her last week. The same stranger kept appearing, sometimes at my office, other times in places I'd never expect. My favorite cafe, a random aisle at the grocery store. Each time, his appearance shifted subtly, as if he were cycling through versions of himself I hadn't yet met. He'd smile knowingly, offer a friendly nod, and walk away, leaving me feeling like I was the one intruding on his world. One night, after another hollow, fragmented day, I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted him in the lobby of my building. "Who are you?" I demanded. My voice shook, and I felt the weight of the question settle in my bones. He just looked at me with something like sympathy. "We've met 1,000 times," he said softly. "You just don't remember yet." I opened my mouth to argue, but something flickered in my mind. A memory, a flash of him standing beside me in different places, different times. The fragments of the memories shattered me. Had we really known each other, over and over again? As I stood there, I felt a strange pull, a weight in my chest as though something fundamental had shifted. The world around me faded, blurred at the edges. And then I understood. I wasn't just seeing glitches in the fabric of reality. I was becoming one of them. The moments I'd lost weren't lost at all. They'd just taken place in versions of my life I hadn't fully lived yet. He was right. We'd met before. It happened late one Sunday night when I was driving home after a weekend with my mom. I had about an hour to go, and since it was nearly midnight, the roads were empty. The whole stretch was bordered by thick woods, and the only other cars I'd passed had been miles back. It was just me, the road, and my headlights piercing the darkness. Around the halfway mark, I spotted someone standing at the edge of the road up ahead, barely visible. As I got closer, I saw it was a man, mid-40s maybe, waving both arms like he was trying to flag me down. His clothes looked worn, but it was the look on his face that threw me. He was desperate. I slowed down instinctively, still a bit unsure, but as I got closer, I could see his eyes. There was something hollow and unnerving about them. I kept going. As my car rolled past, I glanced in the rearview mirror and watched as his face turned toward my car, tracking it until I was out of sight. It made my stomach twist, but I tried to shake it off. I told myself he probably just needed help, though that expression of his lingered in my mind. About 5 minutes down the road, I saw something that made my pulse jump. Headlights appeared behind me. I didn't even see a car pull onto the road, so I wondered if I'd somehow missed it. But as I looked again, I realized something was off. The lights weren't following me at a normal pace. They were catching up fast. My foot instinctively pressed harder on the gas. The headlights got closer and closer, then backed off slightly, then surged forward again, almost like the driver was teasing me. I told myself maybe it was just some jerk trying to spook me, or maybe a car that was racing down the road, but every nerve in my body screamed that this was more than that. I kept my eyes glued to the road, hands tight on the wheel. The woods were endless on either side, and there was nowhere to pull off safely. The headlights swerved to the left, as though he was about to overtake me, then slowed down, lining up directly behind me once more. My mouth went dry. I'd watched enough true crime shows to know what road rage looked like, and this wasn't it. I'd done nothing to this person. This was something else. I watched the speedometer climb as I pushed harder on the gas. The car matched me, staying right on my tail. I reached for my phone, hoping to call someone for help, but when I checked the screen, there was no signal. I dropped it, hands shaking. I could see the details of his car now in my rearview mirror. It was a dark SUV with dents across the front like it had been through some serious damage. A cold realization hit me. Maybe this wasn't just random. Maybe he'd been waiting on that stretch of road, looking for someone alone, someone like me. The road curved up ahead, and I took it fast, hoping I might be able to shake him. But he mirrored my movements perfectly. I could feel the tension building in my chest, the walls of my small car pressing in tighter. Then in a flash, he was gone. Just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he backed off and slowed down. I glanced back, half expecting him to surge forward again, but his headlights stayed at a distance. Relief flooded me, but I spoke too soon. Not even 2 minutes later, I saw him again, this time beside me. He'd somehow taken a shortcut, and now he was pacing my car from the other lane. There were no words exchanged, no gestures. Just his car and mine, locked side by side, barreling down this lonely road with no end in sight. And then I saw him. For just a second, I looked over, and I saw his face in the faint glow of his dashboard. He was staring right at me, eyes wide, but his expression didn't match the intensity of his driving. He looked calm, almost expressionless, like he was on autopilot. And that's what scared me the most. This wasn't someone who'd lost control in a rage. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I couldn't outrun him, not with him right beside me. So, on instinct, I yanked the wheel to the right, veering onto a gravel path leading into the woods. My car jolted violently over the rough terrain, but I didn't stop. The path was narrow and winding, and the trees loomed thick on both sides. I heard the SUV's tires screech as he tried to follow, but the entrance was narrow, and I hoped he wouldn't fit. In my rearview mirror, I saw him trying to turn into the path, but hesitating, realizing he'd have to go slow. That hesitation was my only chance. I gunned it, my car rattling as I hit every rock and dip in the path. The branches scraped the sides of my car, and I could smell the scent of burning rubber and dust. Finally, the path opened into a small clearing, and I took a sharp right, killing my headlights and cutting the engine. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I sat in the pitch black, barely breathing, watching the faint glow of his headlights as he crept slowly down the path, searching for me. He was moving cautiously now, scanning the trees like a hunter searching for prey. The SUV's lights swept over the clearing, briefly illuminating my hiding spot, and I had to bite my lip to keep from gasping. I slouched down in my seat, praying he wouldn't see me. I watched, feeling like time had stopped altogether, until he finally decided to turn back. He reversed, the crunching of gravel growing softer, until he disappeared entirely. I waited a few minutes, every second feeling like an eternity. When I was sure he was gone, I started my car as quietly as I could, then drove the remaining few miles down the dark, winding path until it rejoined the main road. I didn't see him again on my way home, but the entire drive, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. That calm, unbothered stare still burned in my mind. The next morning, I checked the news, half expecting to see reports of another person disappearing along that road. But there was nothing, just me and that stranger on a stretch of highway, and the memory of those headlights in the dark. Every so often, I still wonder if he's out there, watching that road, waiting for someone else who drives past a little too late, a little too alone. I moved into the apartment a little over a month ago. It was small, the paint was peeling, and the hallway lights flickered at night, but I didn't care. It was mine, and after a string of roommates and a long stretch of crashing with family, the space felt like freedom. I was on the 5th floor of a 6-story building, the kind with faded green carpeting and doors that needed a good shove to close. It was an old building, and the tenants had been here forever. The kind of place where neighbors only nodded in the halls and the floors creaked like they had secrets. The first week, nothing was out of the ordinary. The only sounds I heard were the usual city noises. The rumble of the garbage trucks at dawn, someone's dog barking a few floors up, the occasional door slam. Then one night I woke up around 3 a.m. to a faint tapping. It sounded like it was coming from the wall behind my bed, a rhythmic knock, faint but steady. I was half asleep and brushed it off as pipes or something, rolling over and burying myself under the covers. The tapping became a nightly thing. It wasn't loud, just persistent, like someone was knocking on the wall with a single knuckle. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap. I tried everything to block it out. Earplugs, white noise, rearranging the furniture, but it didn't make a difference. I wasn't exactly losing sleep, but it was strange enough to keep me on edge, that steady knock-knock in the dead of night, like someone was trying to get my attention. Then, about a week later, I noticed something even stranger. As I was falling asleep, I heard it again, closer this time, almost like it was coming from inside my apartment. I sat up, my heart pounding, listening as the knocks moved from the wall to what sounded like the closet. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself that old buildings make sounds. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was intentional. And I had to admit, it did sound like someone was on the other side, trying to get me to answer. I decided to ask around. One morning, I caught my neighbor in the hall, an elderly woman named Mrs. Calder, who'd lived in the building for decades. She had this tired look about her, like she'd seen everything this place had to offer, and none of it surprised her anymore. "Do you ever hear, like, knocking?" I asked, feeling ridiculous as soon as the words were out. Her face tightened. "5th floor?" she asked quietly, glancing down the hall toward my door. I nodded. She sighed, shifting her groceries from one arm to the other. "It's an old building," she said, her voice so low I had to lean in. "Things don't always stay quiet. And sometimes," she added, meeting my gaze, "it's best not to answer." I laughed awkwardly, but she didn't join in. "People come and go," she continued, looking down the hall again. "But the walls, they keep things." After that, I couldn't shake her words. I went back to my apartment, trying to convince myself that she was just being weird, maybe even trying to scare me. But the taps kept coming, louder each night, moving from one wall to another, as if someone was inside the walls, tracing a path around the apartment. I started staying up later, hoping to catch the sounds in action, but every time I'd get close to the wall, they'd stop like whoever or whatever it was knew I was listening. Then one night, things escalated. I was lying in bed, listening to the knocks, when they suddenly stopped. For a moment, the silence was thick, almost suffocating. Then, from the direction of my closet, I heard something different, a soft scraping sound like nails against wood. I held my breath, every instinct telling me to get up and leave, but I was frozen. The scraping grew louder, like something was clawing its way out from behind the closet wall. Heart pounding, I threw off the covers and grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight as I walked slowly toward the closet. I could feel the air get colder, the kind of cold that doesn't belong inside. I pulled open the closet door, half expecting to see something standing there. But it was empty, just my coats and boxes. The scratching had stopped. I let out a shaky breath, cursing myself for getting so worked up over nothing. Then I noticed something strange. There was a line of dust on the floor, right up against the back wall, as if it had been recently moved. My pulse quickened. It was late. I was exhausted, but I couldn't ignore it. I leaned in, pushing on the wall. It didn't budge at first, but then, with a bit more force, it gave way, swinging open to reveal a narrow passageway, dark, cramped, and smelling faintly of damp earth. I knew I should have called someone, maybe even the building manager, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside, holding my phone out like a makeshift torch. The passage was lined with old, crumbling bricks, and I could hear the faint sound of dripping water somewhere up ahead. As I moved forward, the air grew colder, and a familiar sense of dread settled over me, like I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see. I followed the passage for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes until I reached a dead end. There, on the floor, was an old, dust-covered radio, the kind with dials and an antenna. The thing looked ancient, completely out of place, and I had no idea how it could still be here. Just as I was about to turn back, the radio crackled to life. A voice came through, soft and garbled, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." My stomach twisted as the voice repeated, clearer this time, the words like a whisper in the dark. "Please help me." I turned and bolted back to my apartment, heart racing, slamming the closet doors shut behind me. I could still hear the knocks, louder than ever, echoing from inside the walls, almost frantic now. I barely slept that night, lying in bed and watching the door, half expecting something to come through. The next day, I tried to find the building manager, but he was nowhere to be found. I asked around, but no one seemed to know much about him. It was as if he'd disappeared. That night, I braced myself for the knocking, but instead, there was silence. I lay in bed, waiting, but nothing happened. Relieved, I let myself relax, thinking maybe whatever it was had finally stopped. But then around 4 a.m., my phone lit up. I checked it, expecting to see a notification or a message, but there was nothing, just the screen glowing softly in the dark. Then, suddenly the radio crackled again. I didn't even own a radio. The voice came through, louder this time, as if it was right next to me. "Please, don't leave me." My chest tightened, and I felt a prickling sensation crawl up my spine. It was my own voice. The walls began to tap, harder and faster, a frantic rhythm like someone was trapped behind them, desperate to get out. I could feel the panic rising, this overwhelming urge to run, but I couldn't move, my body frozen as the taps grew louder and louder, until they were a deafening roar. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because when I woke up, it was morning, and the apartment was silent. I checked the closet, but the passage was gone, just solid wall where it had been. I even went downstairs to see if anyone knew what had happened, but no one had heard a thing. Mrs. Calder was gone too. Her apartment was empty, the door locked tight, as if she'd never even lived there. I moved out that same day, breaking my lease without a second thought. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the knocking, a faint tap-tap that lingers just on the edge of my hearing, like something is still trying to reach me. But I don't answer. I don't think I ever will. When I got the job as a night janitor at Carlton & Sons Accounting, I felt pretty lucky. It wasn't the most exciting gig, but it was quiet, predictable, and the pay was decent. The building was a relic from the 30s, tall, narrow, made of crumbling brick and decorated with fluted columns and tarnished brass fixtures. At night, the empty floors had a strange echo, as if someone were always whispering just beyond my line of sight. Still, I told myself it was just my imagination, probably nerves from working alone in such a creaky old building. The first few nights were nothing special. I'd mop the floors, empty trash cans, wipe down desks. The place was empty after 8 p.m. except for the distant hum of the old-fashioned radiators. Sometimes, I'd hear a door creak or a faint shuffle from somewhere upstairs, but I figured it was just the sound of the building settling. A structure that old had to have some quirks, right? About a week in, I noticed the first odd thing. One of the office doors, usually locked, was cracked open. The sign on it read Files and Records. I'd passed by it dozens of times. It was a storage room with shelves of old ledgers and boxes of documents, all collecting a thick layer of dust. I hadn't remembered seeing it open before, but I assumed one of the employees had left it ajar. I nudged it closed and went on my way. The next night, it was open again. Not just open, it looked like someone had dragged one of the heavy metal filing cabinets to the middle of the room. The drawer was hanging open, and a few yellowed sheets of paper were scattered across the floor. I stood there for a moment, goosebumps prickling the back of my neck. No one should have been in that room, especially not after hours. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the shelves, but the place was empty. I told myself it was just my imagination, picked up the papers, pushed the cabinet back, and left. But the next night, things got weirder. I entered the records room to find the cabinet back in the center of the floor, drawers all open wide this time. And this time, it looked as if something had crawled inside it and dragged papers out in neat, methodical piles. The contents seemed organized in an odd way, each pile consisting of random dates, like the years 1946, 1963, and 1982, each pile arranged meticulously in front of the cabinet. I leaned down to read the pages, but none of it made any sense. Just numbers, names, all scribbled in a thin, spidery handwriting. Each document looked like it had been signed by someone named Yes Carlton, a name I'd never heard mentioned around the office. I tried asking my boss about it the next morning, casually, but he just shrugged. It's probably one of the partner's old relatives. We bought the place from the original family, but all that history is before my time, he said. Probably just some old paperwork no one bothered to clear out. He sounded unbothered, so I let it go, hoping maybe it was just some leftover record keeping. But each night, that cabinet moved further out of place, and the piles of paper grew taller and more deliberate, as if someone was arranging a display just for me. One evening, I arrived early and found a note on my time card, written in that same spidery handwriting. Don't disturb the records. No one else was there to see it, and my hands shook as I read it. I left the card where it was and tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop thinking about that note. Then, around midnight, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the main office floor. I followed the sound to one of the cubicles where I found another file cabinet drawer pulled open, with documents spilling over the sides. A faint shadow hovered above it, like the silhouette of a person, but when I blinked, it vanished, leaving only a chill in the air. I decided to leave early that night, locking up the building and telling myself I'd just come in later the next day. But when I returned, I found another note on my desk. Midnight is a delicate time for records. Don't leave early. For the next few nights, I stuck around. The records room seemed less disturbed when I didn't leave early, as if whatever force inhabited it was pacified by my presence. But on Friday night, I let my curiosity get the better of me. Midnight had just passed, and the tapping sound had started again, soft and persistent. I walked down the hall toward the records room, following the tapping noise until it stopped just as I reached the door. When I stepped inside, I noticed a faint glow coming from the corner, where a single dusty desk lamp flickered on its own. In its dim, yellow light, I saw the figure of an elderly man seated at the desk, hunched over a pile of documents. He was tracing a bony finger down a page, mumbling to himself in a voice that was barely above a whisper. His head jerked up as I entered, eyes wide and dark, like he hadn't seen another person in decades. "Who told you to come in?" he asked, his voice raspy and thin. I stammered something, but the words barely left my mouth. His hand reached up, his fingers impossibly long, almost translucent, like the skin itself had thinned with age. I tried to back away, but my feet felt frozen. He pointed at the files strewn across the desk and said, "Do you know what happens when the records go untended?" I didn't answer. He kept going, his voice almost frantic now, as if I had broken some fragile balance by entering. "The records keep the past in its place," he hissed. "They bind time, hold it steady. Without them, it slips, it breaks," he trailed off, eyes narrowing. "Do you know why you're here?" I could barely think straight. I managed to shake my head, hoping he'd give me something, some answer to explain what was happening. He leaned forward, and I felt a chill seep into my bones as he whispered, "You're here to finish what I couldn't. The records, they need tending." With that, he vanished. One moment, he was there, skin hanging like paper over brittle bones, and the next, he was gone, leaving only the smell of mildew and old paper. I staggered out of the room, trying to catch my breath, feeling his words echo in my mind. The records bind time. I ran out that night, never looked back. I didn't quit formally, just stopped showing up. My boss called a few times, but eventually the calls stopped and I thought I'd escaped it. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I'd wake to that faint tapping sound outside my bedroom door. I'd hear the paper shuffling, that raspy voice whispering. The records, they bind time. And now, each time I close my eyes, I feel myself being pulled back, as if I never really left that place, as if time itself got tangled up with the records I disturbed. I know one day, I'll open my eyes and find myself standing in front of that filing cabinet again, the man's shadowy figure watching over my shoulder. It started on a Tuesday, a day so ordinary I might have overlooked what was happening if it weren't for a single odd detail. I'd come home from work, kicked off my shoes, and tossed my keys on the small table by the door, just like I'd done 1,000 times. But when I turned around, the table was empty. My keys were gone. I checked my pockets, looked around the floor, even dug through my bag to see if I'd somehow missed them. But they were nowhere. I thought maybe I'd left them at the office, so I let it go, assuming they'd turn up. But as the days went by, more little things started to vanish. Not important things, just bits and pieces like my favorite pen, a stray earring I'd left on the bathroom counter, a coffee mug I swore I just put down. Each time, I felt that faint tug of something being off, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Then about a week later, I noticed the silence. It was almost imperceptible, like the air had thickened, pressing down in a way that felt wrong. It was subtle but growing, a heavy, buzzing emptiness that filled every room, every hall. The normal city sounds, traffic, people laughing on the street, dogs barking, all seemed quieter, as if they were being pulled into a void. It got worse when I tried to talk to my neighbors. I'd lived in the building for 5 years, but suddenly, it was like no one remembered me. I ran into Mrs. Craig, my elderly neighbor from down the hall, in the elevator one morning. I gave her a warm smile and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Craig." She looked at me blankly, her face devoid of recognition. "I'm sorry, dear. Do I know you?" My stomach dropped. "Yes, I'm Ava, your neighbor. We've talked a few times." She didn't even blink, just nodded slowly, as if humoring me. When the doors opened, she stepped out without a word, her footsteps echoing down the hallway in that strange, swallowing silence. Back in my apartment, I felt the same quiet weight, like my rooms had grown larger, more echoey, swallowing sounds in a way that left me feeling more and more alone. I decided I'd had enough and called my best friend, James. He was the type of friend you could count on, and I knew he'd ground me, pull me out of this weird fog. The phone rang, but no one answered. After a few tries, I drove to his place. I knocked, then knocked harder. Finally, the door creaked open, and he stood there, but something was wrong. His eyes were vacant, distant. "Hey, you didn't answer your phone, so I thought I'd come by," I said, forcing a smile. He tilted his head slightly, as though the words weren't connecting. "Who are you?" he finally asked. My heart sank. "James, come on, it's me, Ava. Are you okay?" His face twisted slightly. like he was searching for something in my expression. Then he slowly shut the door in my face without saying a word. I stood there, stunned, my mind reeling. We'd been friends for years, but he looked at me like I was a stranger. I went home, trying to rationalize it, but it was hard to think over that relentless, buzzing silence that seemed to amplify every thought, every fear. When I finally fell asleep that night, I dreamed I was alone in an endless, empty version of my apartment. I wandered through the dark, calling out for someone, anyone, but the only response was my own voice echoing back. I woke up drenched in sweat, the silence pressing so thickly around me it felt like I could barely breathe. Over the next few days, things got worse. Rooms seemed to stretch, doorways felt narrower. Sometimes, when I turned a corner, I'd feel certain I'd ended up in an apartment that wasn't mine. One night, I went into the bathroom, and the mirror wasn't there. The wall was blank. I closed my eyes, counting to 10, hoping when I opened them again, things would be back to normal. But when I opened them, the mirror was still gone. And when I turned to leave, I froze. The door to the bathroom was gone too. I screamed, banging on the wall, feeling the cold tile press into my hands. My voice echoed in that closed space, amplifying and feeding back into itself until it felt like I was drowning in sound. Finally, as I was starting to lose my breath, I opened my eyes again, and I was standing in the hallway. I hadn't moved, but the door was there, and the mirror was back. My hands were shaking as I tried to steady myself, the hallway lights flickering as though they, too, were slipping in and out of reality. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the floor shift beneath me, like my apartment was floating in some dark sea. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I threw some clothes into a bag and left, planning to go stay with my parents. But when I stepped out onto the street, everything looked wrong. The buildings seemed taller, the angles sharper. The sky was gray, with strange, swirling clouds that cast a sickly yellow light over everything. I got in my car and drove, but nothing looked familiar. Streets I'd known for years seemed to twist and shift. The landmarks were gone, replaced by cold, unmarked buildings with windows that were completely dark. I tried to call my parents, but the line was filled with static, voices whispering through the hiss, as though from somewhere deep underground. I hung up, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, feeling that creeping sense that I was lost in a place that looked like my world but wasn't. Just then, a voice cut through the static, a woman's voice, faint but clear. "We're waiting for you." I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as I scanned the empty street, but no one was there. I threw my phone to the passenger seat, desperate to escape, and pressed on the gas. After what felt like hours of driving, I found myself back in my apartment building, though I'd had no intention of coming back. The door stood open, a dark hollow waiting, and I realized that I hadn't seen a single person since I'd left that morning. I was alone in a city that had once been mine, but now felt hollowed out, as if something had crept in and replaced every familiar thing with a copy that wasn't quite right. I walked into the lobby, and the door swung shut behind me with a loud echo, sealing me in. As I walked down the hall, I noticed the buzzing sound had returned, louder and more insistent, filling every inch of the space. My heart pounded as I reached my apartment door and found it slightly ajar. I pushed it open and saw myself sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. The other me slowly turned to look at me, her eyes vacant and dull, like she hadn't slept in weeks. Her face broke into a slow, unsettling smile, one that twisted up too high, stretching her cheeks in a way that wasn't natural. I stepped back, my breath coming in short gasps, but she just kept smiling, her expression widening until it looked like her face might tear in two. "You're already here," she said in a voice that was almost mine, but not quite. "There's no one else left." The buzzing grew louder, filling my head with a pressure that felt like it might split my skull. I stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me, but the sound followed, relentless, drowning out my thoughts. Every hallway stretched longer, every corner looped back to the same closed doors. I ran, calling out for help, But there was only that echoing, distorted voice of the other me. We're waiting for you. We've always been waiting. When I finally stopped, panting and desperate, I realized I was back at my door. It was wide open, and inside, everything was still and dark. I could hear my own voice calling out, but from far away, as if it were coming from another world. And then, as I took one step forward, I felt the ground shift under me again, the hallway melting, stretching. I was back inside, with no way out. Now, as I sit here, trapped in a place that feels like mine, but isn't, I can feel them. The copies of people I thought I knew, waiting just beyond the door, shadows pressing closer, murmuring the same thing over and over. We're waiting for you. We're waiting for you. The silence is growing, swallowing even my own thoughts, pulling me deeper into a place I know I'll never leave. I remember the day it started, as clear as if it were playing on a screen in front of me. It was late on a Wednesday night, and I was finishing up my work in the library. My job wasn't glamorous, just cataloging and shelving books in a quiet, nearly empty university library, but I enjoyed the solitude. When I locked up and stepped outside, the night air was crisp, and a thick fog had rolled in. The campus was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. I just reached the path that led to the parking lot when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye, a woman standing under the old oak tree by the library entrance. Her face was turned away, her posture rigid, like she was waiting for someone. She looked vaguely familiar, maybe a student I'd seen studying late a few times. I slowed my pace, feeling an urge to ask if she was all right. But then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. I stopped dead, my heart pounding. I scanned the tree, the nearby bushes, the path stretching back to the library, but there was no one there. The fog shifted, a gust of wind stirring it. And for a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of her figure again, barely visible, as though she was standing just behind a veil. And then she was gone once more. The entire drive home, her image kept flickering in my mind. An after-image burned into my vision. She hadn't looked at me, not directly, but I could have sworn there was something familiar in her silhouette, something unsettlingly close. When I got home, I tried to shake it off. I sat down at my desk, powered on my laptop, and logged in. I barely noticed the time ticking by as I lost myself in work, cataloging books from home, a little side job I did for extra cash. My laptop glitched briefly, the screen flickering, but I didn't think much of it. It wasn't a new machine. But just as I was about to log off, I saw a new folder on my desktop labeled "Don't Forget." I hadn't put it there, but it didn't feel like a typical virus either. It had the same timestamp as my previous file. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. Inside was a single image, low resolution and grainy. It was a photo of the oak tree in front of the library, taken at night. In the foreground stood the woman I'd seen just hours before, staring into the distance with her back to the camera. My stomach dropped. I checked the details of the file, but there was nothing helpful. No location data, no file history. And the timestamp was wrong. It was dated 3 days into the future. I clicked away, closed the laptop, and tried to sleep. But sleep never really came, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. I told myself it was just exhaustion, an overactive imagination, a trick of my tired mind. I didn't open the file again. The next day at work, I shook off the unease as best I could. The library was quiet, just the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft shuffle of pages as students studied at their desks. But as I rounded a corner between the stacks, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being watched. I froze listening, but there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. Then, out of the silence, I heard footsteps, the slow, deliberate kind like someone pacing. I peered down the aisle, expecting to see a student or a professor, but the row was empty. The sound grew louder, footsteps echoing around me, seemingly from everywhere and nowhere. My skin prickled, and I took a shaky step back. I felt like I was going crazy, hearing footsteps in an empty room. I was just about to call it a day and leave early when my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a new message from an unknown number. "Don't forget," it read, followed by an image attachment. My stomach churned, but I opened it anyway. It was the same photo of the woman by the oak tree, but the angle was different this time, like it had been taken from behind her shoulder. I was almost certain I could see her face, but it was blurry, almost distorted, as though it was trying to materialize. I looked around, half expecting her to appear from behind one of the shelves. There was no one. I deleted the message, shoved my phone in my pocket, and left the library, barely taking the time to lock up. I needed to get away from the place, from the eerie silence, from those ghostly footsteps. That night, I couldn't resist the urge to open the file on my laptop again. This time it had changed. The "Don't Forget" folder was gone, replaced by a single document that read, "Look behind you." My hand started to tremble. I clicked it open, and the document was empty. I felt a strange, heavy presence settle around me. Slowly, my eyes drifted to the reflection on my screen, and I saw her, standing right behind me, her face just over my shoulder, barely more than a shadow in the dim glow of the screen. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. My heart was racing, and I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. My apartment was empty, but for a moment, I'd seen her there, her eyes wide, hollow, staring at me as if she knew me. The next morning, I called in sick, unsure if I was actually sick or if I just couldn't face another day at the library. I tried to distract myself, but as I moved through my apartment, I began noticing other strange things. A slight shift in the position of my furniture, the way the clock on my wall seemed to skip forward, then back. And every time I blinked, the room would subtly change, a little skewed, a little wrong, as if it were imitating the shape of my life but failing to get it quite right. As the days passed, these glitches only grew worse. Mirrors would reflect a version of my room that was somehow older, more worn, as if it belonged to a time long past. My own face in the mirror looked off, almost like I was a stranger to myself. Lights would flicker, electronic devices would hum with a low, almost human-sounding frequency, and every night, I would receive the same message from an unknown number. Don't forget. One evening, desperate to break the cycle, I returned to the library after hours. I don't know what I expected to find, but I felt pulled there, like I'd left something unfinished. I found myself standing under the oak tree, staring up at its branches, waiting for something. Then, in the darkness, I heard footsteps, not behind me, but in my own mind, an echo of my own steps, distorted and wrong. I turned, expecting to see the woman again, but instead, I saw myself standing under the tree, staring blankly back at me. My double looked tired, hollow-eyed, with dark circles and a haunted expression, like a ghost caught in the wrong world. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It felt like a hole had opened up, like the fabric of reality was tearing at the seams. My double raised a hand, as if to touch me, and whispered, "Don't forget." And as our hands met, I felt a jolt of pain, like an electric shock, and then nothing. The world went dark. I woke up in my bed, but something was wrong. My apartment was completely still, as if time itself had stopped. My phone sat beside me, with one new notification. It was a message from myself. "Welcome back. Don't forget." And that's when I realized I didn't know if I'd ever really woken. The first time I noticed it, I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through an endless spreadsheet. My job wasn't glamorous. I processed invoices and expenses for a mid-sized company, clocking in the hours and clicking through numbers that blurred into the same shade of gray. That morning, I had a mug of coffee beside me, fresh and steaming. As I took a sip, something odd caught my eye. On the edge of my desk, near my computer, sat a little blue paperclip. Nothing strange about that, right? But I was sure I hadn't seen it before. I used black and silver clips exclusively, and even then, they were always tossed into a drawer. I picked it up, frowning, and examined it, but there wasn't much to see. A simple blue clip, cool and smooth in my hand. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe someone from another desk had borrowed my stapler or pen and left it behind by accident. I tossed it into the drawer and went back to work. But the next day, there it was again, lying in the exact same spot. The same little blue clip, positioned like a forgotten breadcrumb. My pulse quickened as I stared at it. I had definitely put it away yesterday. Now it was back, innocently out in the open, like it had never left. My mind ran in circles. Had I accidentally pulled it out when reaching for a pen? Or had I left it out without thinking? I decided to do a small test. I locked it in the top drawer of my desk, burying it under a stack of folders. The next day, I nearly laughed out loud when I saw it again, in that same impossible spot. No way had it escaped the drawer on its own. I even double-checked, opening the drawer to confirm it was gone from where I'd hidden it. But there it was back on my desk, sitting smugly in plain view. I started questioning myself, wondering if I was going a little crazy, but something inside me bristled, a stubborn need to get to the bottom of it. The paperclip had to be a prank, a joke that someone in the office was pulling on me. I scanned the cubicles, searching for any smirking faces or people watching for a reaction, but everyone seemed focused on their screens. The blue paperclip wasn't the only thing. It was like a tiny domino that set other strange details into motion. I began noticing subtle changes at home, too. One evening, I came back from the grocery store and put my car keys on the hook by the door. But when I went to grab them the next morning, they were lying on the counter instead, arranged exactly in line with the edge, like someone had placed them with meticulous care. Another day, I came home to find my kitchen faucet running at a thin trickle. I'd been so careful to turn it off before leaving, but there it was, almost as if someone had turned it back on right after I'd left. Each event was so small, almost insignificant, but together, they began to form a pattern that tightened around me. Even the people around me felt off, their behavior slightly mechanical, as if they were reading from a script and occasionally forgetting their lines. My neighbor, Mrs. Ruiz, greeted me each day in the same way, her voice like a recording, with the same cheerful, "Good morning, honey." But one day, as I was leaving, I passed her in the hall, and she didn't say a word. She didn't even look at me, just walked by, eyes glazed and unfocused, like she wasn't really there. The next morning, she was back to her usual routine, bright as ever, like nothing had happened. I became hyper-aware, watching the world for even the slightest inconsistencies, and I began noticing repetitions. Cars that drove by at the exact same time every day, in the exact same order, like they were caught in a loop. I'd watch the mailman pause at my neighbor's mailbox every morning at precisely 9:12 a.m., though he never seemed to deliver anything. When I checked my own mailbox, I found the same stack of unopened letters I was sure I'd taken inside just days before. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a soft tapping noise. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the living room. I lay still, heart pounding, trying to think of what could be causing it. I checked every window, every lock before going to bed. I got up and crept out to the living room, where I found the tapping sound coming from my front door. The door itself seemed perfectly normal, but there, right in the center of the floor, was the blue paperclip. It sat in that same unmistakable position, daring me to touch it. That was it. I needed answers. I snatched up the paperclip and took it to work the next day, determined to figure out if anyone else had noticed similar things. I started with my colleague Jenna, a friendly face from down the hall. I casually mentioned the paperclip and asked if she'd ever noticed anything strange in the office. She looked at me like I just told her I'd seen a ghost, and then she forced a nervous laugh. "Oh, you mean like a glitch in the Matrix?" She chuckled again, but it sounded strained. "No, nothing weird here. Just another day in paradise." She quickly changed the subject, but I noticed her eyes flicking toward my desk, and for a split second, they landed on the paperclip in my hand. The following week, everything seemed to escalate. The same items appeared out of place in my apartment. My toothbrush, which I always left in the holder, kept showing up on the bathroom counter, damp like someone else had used it. One morning, I found my favorite mug smashed in the sink, shards of ceramic spread neatly, as if someone had carefully arranged them. I wanted to scream, to confront someone, but there was no one to confront. Only a silent, faceless force that seemed to know my every move, that slipped in and out of my life with invisible hands. I began wondering if I was losing my mind, spiraling into paranoia. But on my way home from work, I spotted a man standing across the street. He was staring directly at me, his gaze unwavering. He was a stranger, yet there was something unsettlingly familiar about him, as if I'd seen him before, but couldn't remember where. He raised his hand and pointed at me, a slow, deliberate gesture. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I wanted to follow him, to demand an explanation, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. That night, I tore through my apartment, searching for anything that might be out of place, some evidence that I wasn't just imagining everything. In the back of my closet, I found a small stack of Polaroid photos that I'd never seen before. My stomach dropped as I flipped through them. Each one was a picture of me, taken from a distance. There I was, walking down the street, sitting at my desk at work, asleep in my bed. In each photo, the angle was slightly different, as if whoever had taken them had been watching me for a long time. The last photo made me freeze. It was of me, holding the blue paperclip, staring straight at the camera with a blank expression. I sat down, feeling numb, as the realization hit me. It wasn't just the paperclip, or the misplaced items, or the strange faces on the street. It was everything. My entire life was a set, a perfectly staged performance down to the smallest detail. And I wasn't the one directing it. I was a puppet, trapped in a routine that I couldn't escape, a prisoner in a life that someone else was controlling. I put the photos back and sat in silence, feeling the weight of the paperclip in my hand. I looked around my apartment, at the furniture, the walls, the same familiar objects that I thought were mine. Now, they felt like props, placed there to keep me in my place, to keep me from seeing the truth. And as I sat there, a strange calm washed over me. Maybe I was just a piece in some grand, invisible game, an actor following a script that I hadn't chosen. But there was one thing I knew for certain. I would never look at that paperclip the same way again. The day the glitches began, it felt like the universe was playing a game. It started small, so subtle I almost convinced myself I was just tired. I'd gotten home late the night before, collapsed onto my bed without even taking my shoes off. When I woke up, though, I noticed my shoes were neatly placed by the door, as if I'd taken them off and set them there. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but there they were, lined up neatly, laces still tied. I brushed it off as a strange half-memory, maybe something I'd done in a daze. But it kept happening. The next day, I put my coffee mug down on the left side of the sink after breakfast, as always. Later that night, I found it drying on the rack, washed and clean. The more I tried to ignore it, the more things seemed to move on their own. I'd leave my keys on the hallway table and find them, inexplicably, in the bathroom. My phone would disappear from my bedside table, only to turn up in the kitchen. The strangest part? It started to feel normal, like there was some hidden logic to it that I just hadn't figured out yet. Then there were the people. I saw her for the first time at the grocery store. This woman who looked almost like me. Not identical, but close enough that I noticed. She had my same black jacket, the same tired look in her eyes. She brushed past me in the cereal aisle without a glance, and I felt a strange pull, like I was supposed to follow her. But by the time I got to the checkout, she was gone. I shrugged it off as one of those strange doppelganger moments everyone jokes about. But I kept seeing her. On the subway one evening, standing in line at a coffee shop, walking down the street. She'd always be just a few paces ahead, disappearing around the next corner before I could catch up. Each time I saw her, it was like she was one step ahead of me, doing the things I'd been planning to do. I'd head to the grocery store, only to find her walking out as I arrived. I'd go to a movie, only to spot her in the back row. It was as if she knew my schedule better than I did. One night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying these strange encounters in my head, wondering if I was just imagining it all. I wandered out into the kitchen for some water and nearly dropped the glass when I saw a small note on the counter. It was my handwriting, no doubt about it, but the message was strange. Don't forget, you've already been here. I stood there staring at it, my mind racing. I didn't remember writing that note. And what did it mean? I went to bed, trying to convince myself I'd written it as some bizarre reminder I'd forgotten. But as I lay there in the dark, a feeling crept over me, a feeling that the note hadn't been left for me by me, but rather by someone else. The next day, I saw another version of myself. It wasn't like the woman I'd been seeing. It was me, down to every detail. She stood in my building's lobby, looking at me with a half-smile that sent a chill down my spine. It was as if she was waiting for me to say something, but no words came out. She turned and walked away, leaving me frozen in place, my heart pounding. When I finally moved, I ran out of the building, only to find the street eerily quiet, like the city had gone silent just for me. That was when I started keeping a notebook. I wanted proof, something to cling to when reality started to blur. Each day, I'd write down where I went, who I saw, even what I ate. I wanted to track the moments when things didn't add up. It didn't help. In fact, it only made things worse. Pages would disappear overnight. Whole days would go missing, like my reality was slipping through my fingers. I'd write something down in the morning, and by night, it was gone. Some nights, I'd wake up to find new entries that I hadn't written, messages in my own handwriting that made no sense. You're getting closer. They're watching. Remember, don't go back. One morning, I noticed that my reflection was behaving oddly. It started with little things like blinking when I hadn't, or smirking when I was serious. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as the days went on, I couldn't ignore it. My reflection seemed to take on a life of its own, mimicking me, but with an eerie delay, like it was waiting for me to notice. I'd walk past a mirror, only to see myself standing there, watching me long after I'd moved out of view. I stopped looking at mirrors after that. I started avoiding anything that might show me my own face. I felt a creeping dread that if I looked too long, something might look back. One night, I heard footsteps in my apartment. I lay frozen in bed, my heart pounding, convinced someone had broken in. But when I mustered the courage to look, there was no one there. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it, except for a new note on the table. This time, it wasn't in my handwriting. It was a childlike scrawl that read, "You're almost ready." Ready for what? I wanted to scream, but there was no one to ask. After that, my life became a series of routines within routines, each one feeling like it was layered over the last. I'd walk to work, only to find myself back at my front door, not remembering how I'd gotten there. People would greet me like they knew me, even though I'd never seen them before. I'd walk into rooms I'd been in 100 times and find them changed in ways that made no sense. A door where there shouldn't be one, or a window overlooking a street I didn't recognize. The last straw was the day I walked into my kitchen to find myself sitting at the table, sipping coffee. She looked up at me with a smirk, not surprised to see me standing there, as if she'd been expecting it. "Finally," she said, setting her cup down. "You took your time." I wanted to say something, to ask her who she was, but the words wouldn't come. She gestured to the seat across from her. "You should sit," she said. "We need to talk about adjustments." Adjustments? My voice sounded strange, foreign, like it wasn't really mine. She nodded, smiling in that detached, almost patronizing way. "You've been realigned. It's time you learned the rules." The rules? My mind was reeling, trying to piece together the fragments of my disjointed reality. "What are you talking about?" But she only gave a shrug, like it didn't matter whether I understood. "You'll figure it out eventually," she said, standing up. "Just remember, you're me now, and I'm wherever I need to be." I watched her walk away, my own footsteps echoing in my ears as she faded from view. And as I sat there, in my own kitchen, staring at the half-finished cup of coffee, a wave of realization washed over me. I was no longer just living in these glitches. I was a part of them, stitched into the fabric of a reality that didn't quite fit. My life now one of endless loops and shifting boundaries. Now each morning I follow the same routine, knowing that something, maybe someone, is watching, waiting for the moment I notice the next clue. It's strange, but I've come to accept it. I no longer question the small changes, the disappearing objects, or the strangers that look too much like me. I am both the observer and the observed, living in a world that bends and twists around me, always one step ahead. It's like I'm on the other side of a mirror now, watching my old life play out in fragments, unable to ever fully return. In the quiet hours, I sometimes catch glimpses of her, the other me, waiting around the next corner, reminding me that this, all of it, was never meant to feel real. And somehow, I think I'm okay with that.